Grizzly kills 37-year-old teacher on wilderness education trip. October 11th, 2025. The morning mist clung to the towering peaks of Banff National Park like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip on the ancient limestone cliffs that had witnessed countless tragedies over the millennia. Laura McKinney pressed her gloved hands against the frost-covered window of the park's Canada Visitor Centre, her breath creating small clouds of condensation as she gazed out at the imposing wilderness that stretched endlessly before her. At 37, she had spent the better part of her adult life teaching fifth graders at Riverside Elementary in Calgary. But this October weekend represented something entirely different, a chance to lead a wilderness education program for adults who wanted to reconnect with nature and learn essential survival skills. The program, officially called Wilderness Reconnection Adult Education in Natural Environments, had been Laura's brainchild, developed over 2 years of meticulous planning and coordination with Parks Canada officials. She had convinced the school board to allow her to use her expertise as both an educator and certified wilderness guide to create something unique, a 3-day immersive experience that would take 12 carefully selected adults into the heart of grizzly country to learn about wildlife conservation, survival techniques, and the delicate balance between human activity and natural ecosystems. Standing beside Laura at the window was Dr. Marcus Chen, a 42-year-old emergency room physician from Calgary General Hospital, who had signed up for the program after experiencing severe burnout from the relentless demands of his medical practice. Marcus had grown up in Vancouver, spending countless childhood summers hiking the coastal mountains with his grandmother. But 15 years of medical school, residency, and practicing emergency medicine had gradually disconnected him from the natural world that had once provided him with peace and clarity. His tall, lean frame bore the slight stoop of someone who spent too many hours hunched over patients and medical charts, and his dark eyes held the perpetual tiredness that seemed endemic among emergency room doctors. "The weather forecast looks promising for the next 3 days," Laura said, her voice carrying the enthusiastic tone that had made her beloved among her students and colleagues. "Clear skies, temperatures ranging from -2 to +8 Celsius, and minimal wind, perfect conditions for what we have planned." She turned to face the growing group of participants who were gathering in the visitor center, their conversations creating a low buzz of excitement and nervous anticipation. Thomas Brennan, a 54-year-old construction foreman from Edmonton, was studying a detailed topographical map spread across one of the wooden tables, his weathered hands tracing the route they would be taking into the backcountry. Thomas had worked construction for over 30 years, building everything from residential developments to massive infrastructure projects. But he had always maintained his connection to the outdoors through hunting and fishing. His participation in the program represented a desire to deepen his understanding of wildlife behavior and conservation, particularly regarding the increasing conflicts between human development and wildlife habitats that he had witnessed firsthand during his construction career. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Walsh, a 39-year-old veterinarian who specialized in wildlife rehabilitation, was examining her camera equipment with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. Sarah had grown up on a ranch in southern Alberta and had always possessed an intuitive understanding of animal behavior. But her veterinary practice had increasingly focused on treating wildlife injured by human activity. Bears hit by vehicles, elk entangled in fencing, and countless other examples of the tragic intersection between human expansion and wildlife habitats. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her green eyes reflected both the excitement of the upcoming adventure and the professional concern of someone who understood the real dangers that existed in grizzly country. Jennifer Morrison, a 45-year-old lawyer from Calgary who specialized in environmental law, was meticulously checking her gear for the third time, her naturally organized personality evident in the way she had arranged her equipment in precise categories. Jennifer had spent the past 2 decades fighting legal battles to protect endangered species and preserve critical habitats, but she realized that her understanding of the natural world was largely theoretical, based on legal documents and scientific reports rather than direct experience. Her decision to participate in the program represented a desire to ground her legal advocacy in actual wilderness experience. The group also included Robert "Bobby" Thompson, a 28-year-old wildlife photographer from Vancouver who had recently returned from assignment in Alaska, where he had spent 3 months documenting the behavior of coastal brown bears. Bobby's youthful appearance belied his extensive experience in dangerous environments, and his quiet confidence suggested someone who had learned to move carefully and thoughtfully in the presence of apex predators. His expensive camera equipment was stored in specially designed cases that would protect it from both weather and potential wildlife encounters. Patricia Williams, a 51-year-old high school biology teacher from Lethbridge, had brought extensive notes and field guides, her academic approach to the wilderness experience evident in her preparation. Patricia had taught environmental science for over 20 years, but had never actually spent extended time in the ecosystems she described to her students. Her husband had died of cancer the previous year, and the wilderness program represented both a personal challenge and a way to honor his memory by finally pursuing the outdoor adventures they had always planned but never accomplished. Standing near the equipment check area was David Kim, a 35-year-old park ranger from Jasper National Park who had volunteered to assist with the program during his days off. David had grown up in Seoul, South Korea, and had immigrated to Canada with his family when he was 15. His path to becoming a park ranger had been unconventional, starting with a computer science degree before realizing that his true passion lay in wildlife conservation and environmental protection. His expertise in bear behavior and backcountry safety would prove invaluable, though none of them could have anticipated just how critical his knowledge would become. The group's unofficial leader, aside from Laura, was Captain James Fletcher, a 43-year-old retired military officer who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian life as a wilderness survival instructor. James had been dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder since his military service, and he found that extended periods in natural environments provided him with the peace and perspective that traditional therapy had been unable to achieve. His military bearing was still evident in his posture and the way he methodically prepared his equipment, but there was a gentleness in his interactions with the other participants that spoke to his genuine desire to help others find healing in the wilderness. Dr. Michael Reynolds, a 47-year-old psychiatrist from the University of Calgary, had joined the program as part of his research into ecotherapy, the use of natural environments to treat mental health conditions. Michael had been studying the psychological benefits of wilderness experiences for over a decade, but his research had been largely based on clinical interviews and surveys rather than direct participation in wilderness activities. His presence on the trip served the dual purpose of advancing his research and addressing his own struggles with depression that had developed during his divorce proceedings the previous year. The final 2 participants were Maria Santos, a 33-year-old environmental journalist from Toronto who was documenting the program for a feature article about wilderness education and conservation, and her husband Carlos Santos, a 36-year-old paramedic who had requested time off from his ambulance service to accompany his wife and participate in the program. Carlos had extensive experience in emergency medical response, but his training had always been in urban environments, and he was eager to learn about wilderness medicine and rescue techniques. As the group finished their equipment checks and gathered around Laura for the final briefing, the atmosphere in the visitor center was charged with anticipation. Outside, the October sun was beginning to burn through the morning mist, revealing the stunning landscape that would serve as their classroom for the next 3 days. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly in all directions, their snow-capped peaks catching the early light and casting long shadows across the valleys below. "Ladies and gentlemen," Laura began, her voice carrying easily across the room, "we're about to embark on what I believe will be a transformative experience for all of us. Over the next 3 days, we'll be hiking approximately 45 kilometers through some of the most spectacular and challenging terrain in North America. Our route will take us from the Bow Valley Visitor Center here, north along the Cascade River Trail, for 8 kilometers to our first campsite at Stony Creek. From there, we'll continue north for another 12 kilometers to our second camp at Flint's Park, and finally, we'll complete a challenging 15-kilometer loop through the Panther River Valley before returning to Flint's Park for our final night." She moved to a large topographical map mounted on an easel, using a laser pointer to trace their planned route. The total elevation gain over the 3 days will be approximately 1,800 meters, with the highest point being Panther Pass at 2,400 meters above sea level. The terrain ranges from well-maintained valley trails to challenging alpine routes that will require careful navigation and weather awareness. David Kim stepped forward to supplement Laura's briefing with crucial safety information. "This is active grizzly bear habitat," he said, his voice serious but calm. "We're traveling during the peak of the pre-hibernation feeding period, which means bear activity is at its highest level of the year. Grizzlies are actively foraging to build fat reserves for winter, and they're consuming up to 20,000 calories per day. This makes them more aggressive and unpredictable than at other times of the year." He gestured to a series of photographs displayed on a nearby bulletin board, showing recent bear signs from the area they would be traversing. "Park biologists have identified at least 7 different grizzly bears currently active in our travel corridor, including 2 sows with cubs and 1 large male that we've designated as Bear 318. This male was captured and radio-collared last spring, and telemetry data shows he's been spending significant time in the Panther River Valley, which is part of our route." The mention of Bear 318 sent a subtle ripple of unease through the group, though none of them could have imagined that this particular animal would soon become the central figure in a tragedy that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. David continued his briefing, explaining the bear safety protocols they would follow, including traveling in tight groups, making noise on blind corners, properly storing food and scented items, and the specific procedures for deploying bear spray in the event of an encounter. Dr. Chen raised his hand with a question that reflected his medical training. "What's the evacuation protocol if someone is seriously injured? How long would it take to get a helicopter to our location?" Laura and David exchanged glances before Laura responded. "Emergency helicopter evacuation from our furthest point would take approximately 45 minutes to an hour, weather permitting. However, the terrain along parts of our route makes helicopter landing extremely difficult or impossible. In the event of a serious medical emergency, we would need to either carry the injured person to a suitable landing zone or call for a ground-based rescue team, which could take several hours to reach us." James Fletcher, drawing on his military experience, asked about communication equipment. "What kind of emergency communication do we have? Satellite phone? Emergency beacon?" "We have both," David replied, patting a small device attached to his belt. "I'm carrying a satellite phone with direct connection to Parks Canada Emergency Dispatch, and Laura has a personal locator beacon that will submit our exact GPS coordinates to rescue coordination centers if activated. Additionally, Both Laura and I have VHF radios that allow us to communicate with other park staff and rescue personnel within range. As the briefing continued, Maria Santos took detailed notes for her article, capturing both the excitement and underlying tension that characterized the group's preparation. Her journalist instincts picked up on the subtle body language and verbal cues that suggested some participants were more nervous about the bear danger than they were admitting. Carlos, meanwhile, was mentally reviewing his emergency medical training, considering what modifications might be necessary for wilderness scenarios. Bobby Thompson was studying the wildlife photography opportunities that David described, particularly interested in the possibility of observing bears from a safe distance. His experience in Alaska had taught him to read bear behavior and maintain appropriate distances, but he was also aware that every bear encounter was unique and potentially dangerous. The weather forecast that Laura had mentioned earlier proved accurate as they loaded their packs and began the short drive to the trailhead. The sky was a brilliant blue, interrupted only by occasional wisps of high-altitude clouds that posed no threat of precipitation. The temperature at the visitor center was just above freezing, but David explained that they could expect it to drop significantly as they gained elevation, with potential for frost during the nights. The Cascade River trailhead, where their adventure would officially begin, was located approximately 15 kilometers north of the visitor center along the Icefields Parkway. As their Parks Canada van wound through the valley, the participants gazed out at the spectacular scenery that surrounded them. Massive limestone cliffs rose on both sides of the valley, their vertical faces carved and sculpted by millions of years of glacial action. Ancient forests of spruce, fir, and pine clung to the lower slopes, their dark green foliage providing a stark contrast to the grey limestone and the brilliant white of snow-covered peaks. The Cascade River Valley has been a major travel corridor for both wildlife and humans for thousands of years, David explained as they drove. Archaeological evidence suggests that indigenous peoples use this route for seasonal migrations and hunting expeditions as far back as 8,000 years ago. The valley provides a natural pathway through the mountains, connecting the eastern slopes with the interior ranges. Laura added historical context from her research into the area. The first European explorers to traverse this route were members of the Palliser expedition in 1858, led by Captain John Palliser. They were conducting a survey to determine the feasibility of building a railway through the Canadian Rockies. Their journals describe encounters with grizzly bears, including one incident where expedition member James Hector was nearly killed by a bear near what is now known as Hector Creek. The mention of historical bear encounters provided an ominous foreshadowing that none of them recognized at the time. As they unloaded their gear at the trailhead, the group was focused on the immediate practical concerns of adjusting pack straps, applying sunscreen, and conducting final equipment checks. The parking area was empty except for their van, a testament to the remote nature of their chosen route and the lateness of the season for backcountry hiking. The trailhead itself was marked by a wooden sign that provided information about trail conditions, bear activity warnings, and emergency contact information. A large map showed their planned route and identified key landmarks, water sources, and designated camping areas. Park regulations required all overnight visitors to register their itinerary and obtain backcountry permits, which Laura had secured months in advance. As they shouldered their packs and began walking, the group naturally spread out over approximately 50 meters of trail, with David taking the lead position to watch for bear signs and Laura bringing up the rear to ensure no one fell behind. The trail began as a well-maintained gravel path through dense forest, following the Cascade River as it tumbled down from the high alpine areas toward the valley floor. The sound of the river provided a constant background murmur that was both soothing and potentially problematic from a safety perspective. David had explained during their briefing that flowing water could mask the sounds of approaching wildlife, making it essential to maintain visual awareness and regularly stop to listen for unusual sounds. The forest through which they hiked was typical of the montane ecosystem found at this elevation in the Canadian Rockies. Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir dominated the canopy, their straight trunks rising 30 to 40 meters toward the sky. The understory consisted primarily of whitebark rhododendron, mountain ash, and various species of berry-producing shrubs that provided crucial food sources for bears preparing for hibernation. Jennifer Morrison, despite her urban lifestyle, found herself captivated by the complexity of the forest ecosystem that David described as they walked. The mountain ash berries that you see everywhere are particularly important for bears right now, he explained, pointing to clusters of bright red berries that hung heavily from numerous trees. A single bear can consume thousands of berries in a day, and the high sugar content helps them rapidly build the fat reserves they need for winter hibernation. Patricia Williams, the biology teacher, was taking detailed notes and photographs of the various plant species they encountered, planning to incorporate her observations into her curriculum when she returned to teaching. Her academic approach to the experience was evident in the way she systematically documented everything from soil composition to tree spacing, treating the hike as an extended field research expedition. The first 2 hours of hiking passed without incident, covering approximately 6 kilometers through gradually ascending terrain. The group maintained good spacing and energy levels, stopping every 30 minutes for brief rests that allowed them to hydrate, adjust equipment, and discuss the natural features they were observing. The weather remained perfect, with temperatures rising to approximately 8 degrees Celsius as the sun climbed higher in the clear sky. It was during their third rest stop, approximately 8 kilometers from the trailhead, that David first noticed signs that would later prove significant. Fresh bear scat, less than 24 hours old based on its appearance and the insects attracted to it, lay directly on the trail about 20 meters ahead of their resting location. The scat was substantial in size, indicating a large bear, and contained berry remains, fur from some small mammal, and what appeared to be fish bones. "Everyone, stay where you are for a moment," David called out, his voice carrying a note of authority that immediately captured the group's attention. He approached the scat carefully, examining it from multiple angles before taking photographs with his digital camera. His years of experience reading wildlife signs allowed him to extract considerable information from this single piece of evidence. "This is definitely grizzly scat from a large individual based on the diameter," he announced to the group. "The content suggests the bear has been feeding on both berries and salmon, which indicates it's been ranging between this elevation and the lower river areas where spawning fish are available. The freshness suggests this bear passed through here sometime yesterday evening or early this morning." Dr. Walsh, with her veterinary background, asked detailed questions about interpreting the scat's contents and what it revealed about the bear's behavior and health. David explained that the presence of salmon remains was particularly significant because it indicated the bear was actively moving between different food sources, covering considerable distances in its daily foraging activities. "Grizzlies are incredibly intelligent and adaptable," he explained. "They create mental maps of their territory that include the locations and timing of different food sources. A bear might feed on berries at this elevation in the morning, then travel down to the river to fish for salmon in the afternoon, then return to higher elevations to feed on roots and other vegetation in the evening." James Fletcher, drawing on his military training in tracking and observation, asked about other signs they should be watching for. David pointed out several additional indicators of recent bear activity: fresh claw marks on nearby trees, overturned rocks where the bear had been searching for insects, and disturbed vegetation where the animal had been feeding on berries. The key thing to understand is that we're traveling through this bear's territory during its most active period of the year, David emphasized. We're not intruders in an empty wilderness, we're visitors in someone else's home, and we need to behave accordingly. As they resumed hiking, the mood of the group had subtly shifted. The discovery of fresh bear signs had transformed the abstract concept of bear country into a concrete reality. Conversations became more subdued, and everyone found themselves scanning the forest more carefully for movement or other signs of wildlife presence. The trail continued climbing gradually through dense forest for another 2 kilometers before emerging into a beautiful alpine meadow that marked their approach to the first night's camping area at Stony Creek. The meadow stretched for approximately half a kilometer, dotted with small clusters of stunted spruce and fir trees that had been shaped by wind and winter weather into twisted sculptural forms. Stony Creek itself was a clear mountain stream that meandered through the meadow, its banks lined with willows and other moisture-loving vegetation. The designated camping area was located on a slight rise above the creek, providing good drainage and reducing the risk of frost damage to their equipment. As they set up camp, the group worked with the efficiency that comes from careful preparation and clear organization. Laura had assigned tent partnerships during their pre-trip planning, pairing participants based on experience levels and compatibility. David and James shared a tent, their combined military and park service experience making them natural partners for security and safety oversight. Dr. Chen and Thomas Brennan were tent mates, their different professional backgrounds creating interesting conversations about the intersection of urban and rural perspectives on wilderness experience. Patricia Williams and Jennifer Morrison shared accommodations, their academic backgrounds providing common ground for discussions about education and environmental law. The married couple, Maria and Carlos Santos, had their own tent, while Dr. Walsh and Dr. Reynolds shared another, their medical backgrounds facilitating discussions about wilderness medicine and the psychological benefits of natural environments. Bobby Thompson had requested a single tent, citing his need for quiet space to review and organize his photographic equipment. The process of setting up camp provided an opportunity for the group to practice the bear safety protocols they had discussed during their briefing. All food and scented items were stored in bear-proof containers provided by Parks Canada, and these containers were placed at least 100 meters from their sleeping area in designated storage locations. David and Laura conducted a thorough inspection of the camping area, checking for signs of recent bear activity and ensuring that all safety protocols were being followed. They established a perimeter around the camp and explained the procedures to follow if a bear entered the area during the night. If you hear or see a bear in camp, do not leave your tent, David instructed. Make noise by banging pots or shouting, but do not use bear spray unless the bear is actually threatening someone. Most bears that enter campsites are simply investigating smells or sounds, and they'll leave on their own if they don't find food rewards. As evening approached, the group gathered around a small camp stove for dinner, the open fires being prohibited due to fire danger and bear safety concerns. The meal consisted of freeze-dried backcountry food that had been carefully selected to minimize strong odors while providing adequate nutrition for their strenuous activities. The conversation during dinner ranged from technical discussions about wilderness medicine and rescue techniques to more personal stories about what had motivated each participant to join the program. Dr. Reynolds shared his research findings about the measurable psychological benefits of wilderness experiences, while Captain Fletcher described how nature-based therapy had helped him deal with post-traumatic stress. Bobby Thompson regaled the group with stories from his photography expeditions, including several close encounters with bears in Alaska and British Columbia. His descriptions of bear behavior provided valuable insights that complemented David's more scientific approach to wildlife education. The most important thing to understand about bears is that they're individuals with distinct personalities and behavioral patterns, Bobby explained. I've photographed bears that were completely habituated to human presence and showed no fear or aggression, and I've encountered others that were immediately defensive and unpredictable. You can't apply a one-size-fits-all approach to bear encounters. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, requiring the participants to add insulation layers and retreat to their tents. The clear sky that had provided perfect hiking weather also meant that radiational cooling would be significant, with temperatures potentially dropping below freezing during the early morning hours. David and Laura took turns conducting security checks throughout the night, using flashlights to inspect the perimeter of the camp and listening for any sounds that might indicate wildlife activity. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals, owls calling from the treetops, small mammals rustling through the underbrush, and the occasional distant howl of wolves from higher elevations. At approximately 2:30 in the morning, David was awakened by sounds that immediately commanded his full attention. Heavy footsteps were moving through the forest approximately 50 meters from their campsite, accompanied by the occasional breaking of branches and the rustling of vegetation. His years of experience allowed him to immediately identify these sounds as being made by a large bear moving through the area. David quietly unzipped his tent and peered out into the darkness, using his ears more than his eyes to track the bear's movement. The sounds continued for approximately 10 minutes, with the bear apparently investigating various scent sources in the area, but never approaching closer than 30 meters to their actual campsite. The incident provided a practical demonstration of proper bear safety protocols. The food storage system worked exactly as intended, preventing the bear from finding any food rewards that might encourage it to return or become more aggressive. The bear's behavior was consistent with normal foraging activity, and it moved on without incident once it determined that no food was available. When David shared the details of the nighttime visit during breakfast the following morning, the group's reaction was a mixture of excitement and nervous apprehension. For most of them, this represented their first confirmed evidence that they were sharing the wilderness with large predators, transforming the theoretical knowledge from their safety briefings into visceral reality. "This is exactly the kind of encounter we want to have with bears," David explained reassuringly. "The bear investigated the area, found no food sources, and moved on without conflict. This demonstrates that our safety protocols are working and that bears can coexist peacefully with humans when proper precautions are taken." The second day of their expedition began with perfect weather conditions and the group's confidence boosted by their successful first night in bear country. The morning routine of breaking camp and preparing for the day's hike proceeded smoothly, with everyone demonstrating improved efficiency in packing and organizing their equipment. Their planned route for day 2 would take them 12 kilometers further north to their second campsite at Flint's Park, following the Cascade River through increasingly rugged terrain. The elevation gain for the day would be approximately 600 meters, culminating in their arrival at an elevation of nearly 2,000 meters above sea level. The trail conditions became more challenging as they progressed, transitioning from the well-maintained valley bottom paths to rougher alpine routes that required more careful navigation and attention to footing. The forest gradually thinned as they gained elevation, with the trees becoming smaller and more widely spaced as they approached the upper limits of tree growth. Approximately 4 kilometers into the day's hike, they encountered their first direct visual evidence of significant bear activity. A large whitebark pine tree beside the trail showed extensive claw marks, extending from the base to approximately 3 meters up the trunk. The marks were clearly fresh, made within the past few days, and the spacing between individual claw marks indicated an exceptionally large bear. These marks were made by a bear standing on its hind legs and reaching as high as possible, David explained, demonstrating the posture by standing against the tree himself. Based on the height of the marks and my own reach, I would estimate this bear could stand nearly 3 meters tall when upright. That suggests a very large male grizzly, probably weighing at least 400 kilograms. Dr. Walsh examined the claw marks with professional interest, noting the depth and spacing of the individual scratches. "What's the purpose of this marking behavior?" she asked. "It's primarily territorial communication," David replied. "Bears use claw marks and scent marking to communicate with other bears about their presence, reproductive status, and dominance. Large males like the one that made these marks are essentially posting a no trespassing sign for other bears. The implications of this discovery were not lost on the group. They were clearly traveling through the territory of an extremely large and dominant male grizzly, the kind of animal that could pose a serious threat if they encountered it under the wrong circumstances." As they continued hiking, David pointed out additional signs of the same bear's presence: more claw marks on trees, daybeds where the bear had rested in sunny spots, and feeding signs where it had torn apart rotting logs to access insects and grubs. The accumulation of evidence suggested that this bear was spending considerable time in the immediate area, making an encounter increasingly likely. "Are we walking into a dangerous situation?" asked Dr. Chen, his medical training making him naturally cautious about preventable risks. David considered the question carefully before responding. "We're in this bear's territory. There's no question about that. But we're taking all the appropriate precautions, traveling in a large group, making noise, and following established trails. Bears generally avoid human contact when they're aware of our presence. The danger comes when bears are surprised, or when they're defending food sources or cubs." James Fletcher asked about alternative routes that might reduce their bear encounter risk. David explained that changing their planned route would actually increase rather than decrease their risk, as it would take them off established trails where bear behavior was more predictable and into areas where they might inadvertently surprise or corner an animal. The conversation was interrupted by Bobby Thompson, who had stopped ahead of the group and was pointing toward a distant slope approximately 500 meters away. "I think I see movement over there," he said quietly, raising his binoculars for a better look. The entire group froze and followed Bobby's gaze toward the indicated slope. Through binoculars, they could indeed see a large, dark shape moving slowly through the scattered trees on the mountainside. The animal was too distant to identify with certainty, but its size and movement patterns were consistent with a bear. "That's definitely a grizzly," David confirmed after examining the animal through his own binoculars. "A large individual, moving slowly and apparently feeding on berries. The distance makes it impossible to determine if this is the same bear that's been marking territory in this area, but the size is certainly consistent." The group watched the distant bear for approximately 10 minutes, with Bobby managing to capture several photographs with his telephoto lens. The bear seemed completely unaware of their presence, methodically working its way through berry patches and occasionally stopping to rest in sunny spots. "This is exactly the kind of bear encounter we hope for," David explained. "We can observe the animal's natural behavior from a safe distance without disturbing or stressing it. The bear is engaged in normal feeding activity and poses no threat to us at this range." Dr. Reynolds found the observation fascinating from a psychological perspective, noting how the group's stress levels had immediately spiked when the bear was first spotted, then gradually decreased as it became clear that the animal posed no immediate threat. "It's interesting how our fight-or-flight response is triggered even when we intellectually understand that we're safe," he commented. As they resumed hiking, the mood of the group was noticeably more focused and alert. The abstract possibility of encountering a bear had been replaced by the concrete knowledge that large predators were actively using the same areas they were traveling through. The terrain continued to become more challenging as they gained elevation, with the trail switching back and forth across increasingly steep slopes. The forest was now dominated by stunted alpine fir and Engelmann spruce, their growth limited by the harsh climate conditions at this elevation. They stopped for lunch beside a small alpine lake that reflected the surrounding peaks like a perfect mirror. The water was crystal clear and so cold that ice crystals formed around the edges despite the afternoon sunshine. The lake provided an opportunity to refill their water bottles and rest their legs before continuing the afternoon's climb to Flint's Park. During lunch, Maria Santos interviewed several group members for her article, capturing their reactions to the morning's bear encounter and their evolving understanding of wilderness safety. Carlos shared his thoughts about how wilderness medicine differed from his urban ambulance experience, noting the challenges of providing emergency care when evacuation might take hours rather than minutes. In the city, I know that if someone is seriously injured, I can have them in a trauma center within 15 minutes, he explained. Out here, we're hours away from definitive medical care, which completely changes how you think about risk assessment and injury prevention. Patricia Williams described how the experience was changing her perspective on environmental education, giving her concrete examples and personal experiences that would make her classroom teaching more vivid and realistic. I've been teaching about ecosystems and wildlife behavior for 20 years, but I've never actually seen these concepts in action, she said. The afternoon portion of their hike took them through some of the most spectacular scenery they had encountered. The trail wound through a series of alpine meadows, punctuated by crystal-clear streams and dotted with late-season wildflowers that had somehow survived the early October frost. The views in all directions were breathtaking, with snow-covered peaks stretching to the horizon and deep valleys carved by ancient glaciers. As they approached Flint's Park, their destination for the second night, the elevation had reached nearly 2,000 meters above sea level. The air was noticeably thinner, and several group members were experiencing mild symptoms of altitude adjustment, including slight headaches and increased breathing rates. Flint's Park itself was a large alpine meadow situated on a plateau between two towering peaks. The camping area was located near a small tarn that provided both water access and a stunning reflection of the surrounding mountains. The designated camping spots were marked by stone fire rings and bear-proof storage lockers that had been installed by Parks Canada. The process of setting up their second camp proceeded more efficiently than the previous evening, with everyone now familiar with the routines and safety protocols. However, David noticed several concerning signs as he conducted his usual inspection of the camping area. Fresh bear tracks, less than 6 hours old, were clearly visible in the soft mud around the tarn. The tracks were massive, with front paw prints measuring nearly 30 centimeters in length and showing the distinctive long claws of a grizzly bear. More concerning was the depth of the impressions, which suggested an animal weighing well over 400 kilograms. "These are definitely the largest bear tracks I've ever seen in this area," David told Laura privately as they examined the prints. "The size and depth suggest an exceptionally large male, probably the same animal that's been marking territory along our route." They decided to share this information with the group during their evening briefing, emphasizing the importance of strict adherence to safety protocols during the night. The tracks showed that the bear had approached within 50 meters of their current camping location, close enough to be concerned, but not indicating aggressive or threatening behavior. The good news is that these tracks show the bear was moving steadily through the area rather than lingering or investigating specific locations, David explained to the group. "This suggests normal traveling behavior rather than territorial defense or food seeking." Dr. Chen asked about the timing of the tracks and whether they might encounter the bear during the night. David explained that the freshness of the tracks made it unlikely the bear would return to the immediate area, as grizzlies typically don't retrace their travel routes within short time periods. The evening routine proceeded much as it had the previous night, with dinner prepared on camp stoves and conversations ranging from technical discussions about wildlife behavior to personal reflections on the day's experiences. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, requiring everyone to add insulation layers and retreat to their tents earlier than they had the previous evening. The night passed without incident, though David's security checks revealed additional evidence of wildlife activity in the surrounding area. Fresh elk tracks suggested that a small herd had passed through during the early evening hours, and the distant howling of wolves indicated that predators were active throughout the region. The third day of their expedition dawned clear and cold, with frost covering their tents and a thin layer of ice on the tarn. The temperature at sunrise was approximately -4 degrees Celsius, but the clear sky promised rapid warming once the sun rose above the surrounding peaks. Their planned route for the final day was the most challenging of the expedition, a 15-kilometer loop through the Panther River Valley that would take them to the highest elevation of their trip before returning to Flint's Park for their final night. The total elevation gain would be approximately 800 meters, culminating at Panther Pass at 2,400 meters above sea level. The trail began by descending from their camping area into the Panther River Valley, following a series of switchbacks through increasingly dense forest. The river itself was smaller than the Cascade River they had been following, but it was equally clear and cold, fed by snowmelt and springs from the high alpine areas. As they descended into the valley, the forest composition changed noticeably. The alpine species that had dominated at higher elevations gave way to larger spruce and fir trees, with a dense understory of berry-producing shrubs that provided excellent habitat for both black bears and grizzlies. This valley represents prime bear habitat during the fall feeding period, David explained as they hiked. The combination of diverse food sources, water access, and dense cover makes it ideal for bears preparing for hibernation. Park biologists have documented some of the highest bear densities in the entire region in this valley system. The mention of high bear densities added another layer of tension to the group's already heightened awareness. They had now been in the backcountry for 2 full days, encountering increasingly fresh signs of bear activity, and they were entering what amounted to bear central habitat during the most dangerous time of year. Approximately 3 kilometers into the valley, they encountered the most significant bear sign yet, a large daybed that had been used very recently, possibly within the past 12 hours. The bed was a depression in the soft earth beneath a large spruce tree, surrounded by scattered vegetation that the bear had arranged for comfort and insulation. This is where a bear rested, probably during the warmest part of yesterday afternoon, David explained, examining the site carefully. The size of the depression and the arrangement of the bedding material suggest a very large animal, almost certainly the same individual whose tracks we've been seeing. Dr. Walsh asked about the bear's likely current location based on this evidence. David explained that grizzlies often had multiple daybeds throughout their territory, using them during different parts of their daily feeding cycles. Bears are creatures of habit, with fairly predictable daily routines, he said. They typically feed actively during early morning and late afternoon, resting during the heat of the day and moving to different elevations based on food availability and weather conditions. As they continued deeper into the valley, the evidence of bear activity became overwhelming. Claw marks on trees were visible every few hundred meters, berry bushes showed signs of intensive feeding, and overturned rocks and torn-apart logs indicated systematic foraging for insects and grubs. "We're clearly in this bear's core territory," David acknowledged. The concentration of signs suggests this animal spends most of its time in this immediate area, which makes sense given the abundance of food sources and the protection offered by the dense forest cover. James Fletcher asked whether they should consider turning back, given the obvious intensity of bear activity in the area. David and Laura consulted privately before deciding to continue with increased caution, emphasizing that their safety protocols were designed for exactly this type of situation. "We're taking all appropriate precautions, and we're traveling as a large group during daylight hours," Laura explained. "The bear is clearly using this area, but there's no indication of aggressive or defensive behavior. We'll continue with heightened awareness and be prepared to retreat if conditions change." The decision to continue would prove to be the most fateful choice made during the entire expedition. Unknown to the group, their assessment of the situation, while professionally sound, was based on incomplete information about the specific bear they were encountering. Bear 318, the radio-collared male that David had mentioned during their initial briefing, was indeed the animal whose signs they had been following throughout their journey. At 6 years old and weighing approximately 900 pounds, he was in his physical prime and had established dominance over a territory covering nearly 200 square kilometers of prime grizzly habitat. What the park's wildlife biologists didn't know, and what couldn't be determined from radio telemetry data, was that Bear 318 had recently begun exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior toward humans. 3 weeks earlier, he had charged 2 backpackers near Bow Lake, stopping just short of contact before retreating. 2 weeks before that, he had destroyed a research camp in the Skokie Valley, apparently in response to food odors, despite the researchers following all proper storage protocols. These incidents had not been reported to Parks Canada through official channels, and the pattern of escalating aggression had not been identified by wildlife managers. Bear 318 was considered a normal, healthy adult male grizzly with typical behavior patterns and no history of human conflict. The reality was far different. Bear 318 had learned to associate human presence with food opportunities, initially through encounters with improperly stored camping supplies and garbage. Over time, this association had evolved into actively seeking human contact as a feeding strategy, making him increasingly dangerous to anyone entering his territory. As Laura's group continued hiking deeper into the Panther River Valley, they were unknowingly walking directly into the territory of a bear that had crossed the line from normal wildlife behavior to predatory interest in humans. The signs they were interpreting as normal feeding activity were actually markers of an animal that was actively patrolling his territory and investigating human presence. The trail through the valley bottom was narrow and winding, following the meandering course of the Panther River through dense forest that limited visibility to approximately 30 meters in most directions. The sound of flowing water masked other noises, and the thick canopy created a twilight atmosphere even during midday. "This is exactly the type of terrain where bear encounters become dangerous," David explained as they walked. "Limited visibility, noise from the water, and multiple escape routes for wildlife create conditions where animals and humans can surprise each other." To mitigate these risks, David implemented enhanced safety protocols. The group traveled in tighter formation, with no more than 20 meters between the lead and rear positions. They made more noise, calling out regularly and clapping hands before blind corners or areas with particularly limited visibility. Bobby Thompson, who had been documenting the expedition with his camera equipment, noticed something unusual approximately 5 kilometers into the valley. "There are what look like fresh scratches on that tree trunk," he said, pointing to a large spruce tree about 40 meters ahead of their position. David approached the tree carefully and immediately recognized that these were not normal claw marks. The scratches were at eye level for an adult human, far lower than typical bear marking behavior, and they appeared to have been made with significant force and intent. "These marks are different from what we've been seeing," David said, his voice carrying a note of concern that hadn't been present earlier. "They're too low for normal territorial marking, and the pattern suggests aggressive rather than communicative behavior." As he examined the marks more closely, David found something that sent a chill through his professional assessment of their situation. Embedded in the bark near the claw marks were several strands of what appeared to be fabric, consistent with synthetic outdoor clothing material. "Someone's been here recently," he announced to the group, "and they may have had a close encounter with the bear we've been tracking." The fabric evidence suggested that another hiker or backpacker had been pressed against this tree, possibly during a defensive encounter with the bear. Laura immediately checked her permit records and radio communication with Parks Canada Dispatch to determine if any other groups were registered to be in the area. The response was negative. No other backcountry permits had been issued for the Panther River Valley during the past week. "This could be evidence of an unreported bear encounter," David explained grimly. "Someone may have had an aggressive contact with this bear and either didn't report it or wasn't able to report it." The discovery transformed their risk assessment completely. They were no longer dealing with a bear displaying normal territorial behavior, but potentially with an animal that had already shown aggression toward humans. The fabric evidence suggested that the encounter had been recent, possibly within the past few days. Dr. Chen asked the obvious medical question: should we be looking for an injured person? If someone had a bear encounter here, they might need medical assistance. David and Laura made the decision to conduct a limited search of the immediate area, looking for any additional evidence of human presence or signs of an injured hiker. The group spread out in a line formation, maintaining visual contact while systematically examining the forest floor and surrounding vegetation. It was Patricia Williams who made the discovery that confirmed their worst fears. Approximately 100 meters from the marked tree, partially concealed under a fallen log, she found a backpack that had been severely damaged by what could only have been a bear attack. "Over here," she called out, her voice shaking. "I found something." The backpack was a high-quality mountaineering pack, similar to those carried by the group, but it had been torn apart with tremendous force. Claw marks were clearly visible on the fabric, and the contents were scattered across a wide area. Most disturbing was the presence of bloodstains on both the pack and surrounding vegetation. David's examination of the scene revealed a story that none of them wanted to acknowledge. The pattern of damage and blood distribution suggested that someone had been caught by the bear while wearing or carrying the backpack. The amount of blood present indicated significant injury, though there was no body visible in the immediate area. "We need to contact Parks Canada Emergency Services immediately," David announced, activating his satellite phone. "This is evidence of a serious bear attack, and we need to report it and get emergency personnel to this location." As David made the emergency call, the rest of the group remained frozen around the attack scene, trying to process the implications of what they had discovered. They were no longer on a wilderness education expedition. They had become witnesses to what appeared to be a fatal bear attack. The satellite phone connection to Parks Canada Emergency Dispatch took several minutes to establish due to the mountainous terrain and dense forest cover. When contact was finally made, David provided their exact GPS coordinates and a detailed description of what they had found. "This is Ranger Kim calling from GPS coordinates 51.4789 north, 116.2156 west, he reported. "We have discovered evidence of what appears to be a serious bear attack in the Panther River Valley. We have found a severely damaged backpack with blood evidence, but no victim at the scene. Request immediate emergency response and guidance on search procedures." The response from emergency dispatch was immediate and professional. "Ranger Kim, this is Parks Canada Emergency Coordination. Maintain your position and secure the scene. Do not disturb any evidence or attempt to search for the victim. Emergency response teams are being dispatched to your location. Estimated arrival time is 45 minutes by helicopter. While they waited for emergency response, David established a security perimeter around the attack scene and conducted a careful inventory of the scattered backpack contents. The items told a story of an experienced backpacker. High-quality gear, emergency supplies, and a backcountry permit that identified the victim as Michael Harrison, a 32-year-old software engineer from Vancouver. According to his permit, Harrison had been planning a solo 4-day hike through the same area that Laura's group was now traversing. His planned route would have brought him to this exact location 2 days earlier, which was consistent with the apparent age of the blood evidence and damaged equipment. We're dealing with a solo hiker who was attacked by the same bear whose territory we've been traveling through, David explained to the group. The timing suggests this happened while we were at our first campsite, approximately 48 hours ago. The implications were terrifying. They had been hiking through the territory of a bear that had recently killed or seriously injured a human being. The animal's behavior patterns and territorial marking that they had been observing took on an entirely different and sinister meaning. Dr. Reynolds, despite his psychiatric training, found himself struggling to process the psychological impact of their discovery. Are we saying that we've been following the trail of a bear that has already attacked someone? That we've been walking into this situation for 2 days? That's exactly what we're saying, David replied grimly. And it means that our risk assessment has been completely wrong from the beginning. We're not dealing with normal bear behavior. We're dealing with an animal that has already demonstrated willingness to attack humans. James Fletcher, drawing on his military experience with dangerous situations, asked about immediate tactical considerations. What's our defensive posture? Do we retreat to a more defensible position while we wait for emergency response? David considered the tactical situation carefully. They were in a narrow valley with limited visibility and multiple potential approach routes for a bear. Their current position near the attack scene was relatively open, which provided good sight lines but also made them visible to any wildlife in the area. We'll move to that rocky outcropping about 50 meters uphill, David decided, pointing to a position that would give them elevation advantage and limit the directions from which a bear could approach undetected. We'll maintain our tight group formation and have bear spray ready for immediate deployment. As they moved to their defensive position, the sound of an approaching helicopter became audible in the distance. The emergency response time had been faster than predicted, with the helicopter arriving approximately 30 minutes after David's initial call. The helicopter was a Bell 212 operated by Parks Canada Emergency Services, equipped for both search and rescue operations and medical evacuation. The crew included 2 paramedics, a wildlife specialist, and a pilot experienced in mountain rescue operations. Landing in the confined space of the valley bottom required considerable skill, with the pilot having to maneuver around tall trees and deal with unpredictable wind currents created by the mountainous terrain. The helicopter touched down approximately 100 meters from the attack scene, and the emergency team immediately began their investigation. Wildlife specialist Dr. Janet Morrison, no relation to group member Jennifer Morrison, took charge of the scene investigation, working with David to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to the attack. Her 20 years of experience investigating bear attacks throughout Western Canada made her uniquely qualified to interpret the evidence. Based on the blood pattern and the damage to the backpack, this was a contact attack rather than a defensive encounter, Dr. Morrison explained after examining the scene. The victim was likely caught by surprise and unable to deploy bear spray or other defensive measures. The helicopter crew conducted an aerial search of the surrounding area, looking for any trace of Michael Harrison or additional evidence related to the attack. The search covered approximately 10 square kilometers, focusing on drainage areas and thick vegetation where a victim might have sought shelter or where remains might be concealed. After 2 hours of intensive searching, no trace of Harrison was found beyond the attack scene itself. The lack of a body or additional blood trail suggested either that he had been carried away by the bear or that he had somehow escaped the immediate area, despite serious injuries. The absence of a body doesn't necessarily mean the victim survived, Doctor Morrison explained to Laura's group. Bears sometimes cache their kills in dense vegetation or rocky areas where they're difficult to locate from the air. We'll continue ground searches, but the probability of finding Harrison alive decreases rapidly with each passing hour. The discovery of the attack scene fundamentally changed the nature of Laura's expedition. They were no longer wilderness education participants. They had become material witnesses in a potential homicide investigation and were themselves at risk from the same predator that had apparently killed Harrison. Parks Canada emergency protocols required the immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from the area until the aggressive bear could be located and dealt with. However, the helicopter's weight limitations meant that only 6 people could be evacuated in the first flight, requiring a second trip to remove the remaining group members. The selection of who would leave in the first evacuation became a source of tension within the group. Dr. Chen argued that his medical training made him valuable for any rescue operations, while James Fletcher's military experience suggested he should remain to assist with security. Laura felt responsible for her participants and wanted to ensure everyone's safety before leaving the area herself. The decision was ultimately made by Dr. Morrison based on Parks Canada emergency protocols. The 6 evacuees in the first helicopter flight were Patricia Williams, Jennifer Morrison, Dr. Reynolds, Dr. Walsh, Maria Santos and Carlos Santos. They would be flown directly to the Parks Canada headquarters in Banff for debriefing and medical evaluation. The remaining 6 group members, Laura, David, Dr. Chen, Thomas Brennan, James Fletcher and Bobby Thompson, would remain at the scene to assist with the ongoing search and investigation. Their wilderness experience and various professional skills made them valuable resources for the emergency response operation. As the helicopter departed with the first group of evacuees, the mood among those remaining became increasingly tense. They were now actively participating in a search for a missing person, while simultaneously being hunted by a bear that had already demonstrated its willingness to attack humans. Dr. Morrison established a command post using portable radio equipment and satellite communication systems that would allow coordination with Parks Canada headquarters and other emergency response resources. The search for Michael Harrison would continue using both aerial and ground-based teams, while wildlife management specialists worked to locate and deal with the aggressive bear. Our immediate priority is finding Harrison if he's still alive, Dr. Morrison explained to the remaining group members. Secondary priorities include locating the bear responsible for the attack and ensuring the safety of all personnel in the area. This situation requires careful coordination between search and rescue operations, wildlife management, and law enforcement. The search pattern established by Dr. Morrison focused on areas where an injured person might seek shelter or where a bear might cache a kill. Ground teams would work in pairs, maintaining radio contact and following strict safety protocols that included constant availability of bear spray and immediate evacuation procedures if the aggressive bear was encountered. Laura and David were paired as one search team, their combined knowledge of the area and experience with wildlife safety making them effective partners. Dr. Chen and Thomas Brennan formed another team, with Chen's medical training complementing Brennan's outdoor experience. James Fletcher and Bobby Thompson comprised the third team, combining Fletcher's military tracking skills with Thompson's experience observing wildlife behavior. The search began systematically, with each team assigned specific grid coordinates and required to report their status every 15 minutes via radio. The terrain made searching extremely difficult, with dense vegetation, steep slopes, and numerous hiding places where evidence could easily be concealed. It was James Fletcher and Bobby Thompson who made the next significant discovery approximately 3 hours into the search. Following a game trail that led away from the main attack scene, they found additional blood evidence and torn clothing approximately half a kilometer downstream from where Harrison's backpack had been discovered. "Command, this is Team 3, Fletcher reported via radio. "We have additional evidence at GPS coordinates 51.4762 north, 116.2, 218 west. Blood trail and clothing fragments suggest the victim moved or was dragged in this direction." The discovery of the secondary evidence site provided hope that Harrison might have survived the initial attack and sought shelter somewhere in the area. However, the amount of blood present at both scenes suggested serious injuries that would require immediate medical attention to prevent death from blood loss or infection. Dr. Morrison coordinated the response to the new evidence, bringing all search teams to the secondary site and expanding the search pattern downstream along the creek that Harrison appeared to have been following. The creek provided a natural navigation aid for an injured person, but it also led into increasingly difficult terrain that would be challenging for rescue operations. As the afternoon progressed, the search teams found additional evidence of Harrison's passage. More blood on rocks beside the creek, a torn piece of his jacket caught on a fallen tree, and footprints in soft mud that showed an irregular gait consistent with serious injury. The evidence suggests that Harrison survived the initial attack and was able to move under his own power, at least initially, Dr. Morrison reported to Parks Canada headquarters. However, the amount of blood loss indicated by the trail suggests critical injuries. We need to find him quickly if there's any chance of survival. The tracking became more difficult as the creek entered a narrow canyon with steep rock walls on both sides. The terrain was treacherous, even for uninjured rescuers, and the possibility that Harrison had attempted to traverse this area while seriously wounded was both admirable and terrifying. Laura and David, working as the lead tracking team, found themselves climbing over massive boulders and traversing narrow ledges as they followed the blood trail deeper into the canyon. Their progress was slow and dangerous, requiring careful rope work and constant communication with the command post. "This terrain is incredibly dangerous for someone with serious injuries," Laura reported via radio. "If Harrison came through here, he was either desperate or disoriented. The exposure to falling rocks and the complexity of the route would be challenging even for an experienced mountaineer in good condition." As they worked their way deeper into the canyon, David noticed something that made him freeze in place. Fresh bear tracks in the sand beside the creek, less than an hour old, showing that the aggressive bear was still actively patrolling the area where Harrison had fled. "Command, this is Team 1, David reported urgently. "We have very fresh bear sign at our current location. The animal is still active in this immediate area. Request guidance on whether to continue tracking or establish defensive positions." The response from Dr. Morrison was immediate and clear. "All teams maintain current positions and prepare for immediate extraction. We have a confirmed aggressive bear in the search area, and personnel safety takes priority over search operations." The helicopter was recalled from its aerial search pattern and directed to the canyon area to extract the ground teams before the bear situation became more dangerous. However, the narrow canyon and unstable air currents made helicopter extraction from their current positions impossible. Teams need to extract to the open area approximately 800 meters downstream from current positions, the helicopter pilot reported. Cannot safely operate in the confined canyon area. Teams will need to move to extraction point under their own power. The movement to the extraction point required the three search teams to traverse the same dangerous terrain that Harrison had apparently navigated while injured. The difference was that they now knew an aggressive bear was actively patrolling the area, making every step potentially life-threatening. James Fletcher took point for the extraction movement, using his military experience to establish a defensive formation that would allow the teams to move quickly while maintaining security against potential bear attack. Each team member carried bear spray in the ready position, and they maintained constant radio communication with both each other and the helicopter overhead. The movement to the extraction point took 45 minutes of careful navigation over treacherous terrain. During this time, Bobby Thompson reported seeing movement in the forest above them that was consistent with a large bear paralleling their route. The animal was maintaining its distance but appeared to be tracking their movement through the canyon. "We're being shadowed by what appears to be a large bear, approximately 200 meters upslope from our position," Thompson reported. "Animal is moving parallel to our route, but maintaining distance. Behavior suggests active tracking rather than coincidental presence." Dr. Morrison's response reflected the gravity of their situation. "Continue movement to extraction point with maximum caution. Helicopter is standing by for immediate pickup. Deploy bear spray immediately if animal approaches within 50 meters." As they reached the extraction point, the helicopter was already approaching for landing. The pilot had identified a small clearing beside the creek that would allow a quick pickup, though the confined space meant that all 6 remaining team members would need to board quickly and efficiently. The extraction proceeded without incident, though Bobby Thompson reported seeing the bear moving closer to their former position as the helicopter lifted off. The animal had apparently been waiting for them to become more vulnerable before approaching, demonstrating a level of tactical awareness that was deeply disturbing. "That bear was hunting us," Thompson told Dr. Morrison as they flew toward Parks Canada headquarters. "It wasn't just defending territory or responding to our presence. It was actively tracking our movement and waiting for an opportunity to attack." The flight back to Banff provided an opportunity to review the evidence they had collected and plan the next phase of the search and wildlife management operation. The discovery of Harrison's trail into the canyon had provided hope that he might still be alive, but the presence of an aggressive bear in the same area made rescue operations extremely dangerous. Parks Canada's response to the situation would ultimately involve multiple agencies and dozens of personnel. Wildlife management specialists would need to locate and deal with the aggressive bear. Search and rescue teams would continue looking for Harrison, and law enforcement officials would investigate the circumstances that had led to the attack. The 6 participants who had been evacuated in the first helicopter flight were waiting at Parks Canada headquarters when the search teams arrived. Their debriefing had revealed additional information about the signs of bear activity they had observed during their expedition, providing wildlife specialists with a more complete picture of the animal's behavior patterns. "The bear sign we documented over the past 3 days shows an animal that was actively patrolling a large territory and marking it more extensively than normal," Dr. Walsh reported during the combined debriefing. "In retrospect, the intensity of marking behavior should have been recognized as a warning sign of aggressive tendencies." Dr. Morrison used the group's observations to create a detailed behavioral profile of the bear they were dealing with. The animal was clearly a large, dominant male that had established territorial control over a significant area. More concerning was evidence suggesting that it had learned to associate human presence with feeding opportunities, making it actively dangerous to anyone entering its territory. "We're dealing with what wildlife management calls a problem bear, an animal that has lost its natural fear of humans and begun to view them as either food sources or territorial threats," Dr. Morrison explained. "These bears are extremely dangerous, because they combine the intelligence and physical capabilities of apex predators with learned behaviors that make them seek out rather than avoid human contact. The immediate priority was locating and dealing with the aggressive bear before it could attack additional victims. Wildlife management protocols required that bears involved in fatal attacks be destroyed, both to eliminate the immediate threat and to prevent them from teaching aggressive behaviors to other bears in the area. However, locating a specific bear in the vast wilderness of Banff National Park presented significant challenges. The animal's radio collar would allow wildlife managers to track its general location, but close approach would require careful planning and specialized equipment to ensure the safety of park personnel. While wildlife management teams prepared their response to the bear situation, search and rescue operations continued looking for Michael Harrison. The blood trail that had been followed into the canyon suggested that he had survived the initial attack, but the amount of blood loss and the time that had elapsed made survival increasingly unlikely. The search operation was expanded to include additional helicopter crews, ground-based search teams, and specialized equipment for accessing difficult terrain. The Canadian Forces provided a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging cameras that could detect body heat even in dense forest conditions. As night fell on the third day since Harrison's apparent attack, search teams had covered approximately 25 square kilometers without finding any additional trace of the missing hiker. The terrain in the area where his trail had disappeared was so rugged and dangerous that ground searches were limited to daylight hours and experienced mountaineering personnel. We're reaching the point where survival becomes statistically unlikely, Doctor Morrison reported to Parks Canada management during the evening briefing. If Harrison is still alive, he would be suffering from severe blood loss, exposure, and dehydration. Without immediate medical intervention, his chances of survival diminish rapidly with each passing hour. The psychological impact on Laura's group was becoming increasingly apparent as the reality of the situation settled in. They had spent 3 days hiking through the territory of a bear that had apparently killed another person, and their own survival had depended on luck as much as on their safety precautions. Dr. Reynolds, despite his psychiatric training, found himself struggling with intrusive thoughts about what might have happened if they had encountered the aggressive bear during their expedition. "We were completely vulnerable," he admitted during a private conversation with Laura. "If that bear had decided to attack our group, our safety protocols would have been useless against an animal that size." The trauma was particularly acute for Bobby Thompson, whose experience photographing bears had given him a deep appreciation for their physical capabilities. "I've seen what grizzlies can do to elk and moose," he said. "The idea that we were being watched by an animal like that for 3 days is terrifying." Laura felt a crushing sense of responsibility for having led the group into danger, despite the fact that Parks Canada had approved their route and provided current safety information. "I should have recognized the signs," she told Dr. Morrison. "The intensity of bear activity we observed should have triggered a route change or early termination of the expedition." Dr. Morrison's response reflected her years of experience investigating wildlife incidents. "The signs you observed were consistent with normal territorial behavior for a dominant male grizzly during fall feeding season. The aggressive tendencies that led to Harrison's attack were not predictable based on the available evidence. You followed all appropriate safety protocols and made reasonable decisions based on the information available at the time. The investigation into how the situation had developed would ultimately reveal significant gaps in Parks Canada's wildlife monitoring systems. Bear 318's radio collar provided location data, but no information about behavioral changes that might indicate increased aggression. The incident reports that might have warned of his dangerous tendencies had not been filed through proper channels, leaving wildlife managers unaware of the escalating threat. Parks Canada's immediate response included closing the entire Panther River Valley to public access and implementing enhanced bear monitoring protocols throughout the region. The incident would ultimately lead to significant changes in how wildlife management agencies track and respond to potentially aggressive bears. On the fourth day after Harrison's disappearance, the thermal imaging helicopter detected what appeared to be a human heat signature in a remote area approximately 3 kilometers from where the blood trail had ended. The signature was weak and stationary, suggesting either a deceased person or someone who was severely incapacitated. The location was accessible only by helicopter insertion due to extremely difficult terrain that included vertical rock faces and unstable talus slopes. A specialized rescue team consisting of paramedics and technical rescue specialists was assembled for what would likely be a recovery operation rather than a rescue. Dr. Chen volunteered to accompany the rescue team, providing additional medical expertise for what was expected to be a traumatic situation. His emergency room experience with severe trauma cases made him uniquely qualified to assess Harrison's condition and provide immediate treatment if the victim was still alive. The helicopter insertion required exceptional skill from the pilot, as the only available landing zone was a small ledge approximately 50 meters from the heat signature location. The rescue team would need to rappel down a near-vertical cliff face to reach what appeared to be a shallow cave or rock shelter where the signature had been detected. As the rescue team rappelled toward the signature location, they could see evidence of recent bear activity in the area, including claw marks on rocks and disturbed vegetation. The proximity of bear sign to Harrison's apparent shelter suggested that the aggressive animal had been investigating the location, though it was not currently visible in the immediate area. The discovery of Michael Harrison's body in the rock shelter would provide both closure and additional trauma for everyone involved in the search operation. Harrison had apparently survived for approximately 2 days after the bear attack, using his emergency medical training to treat his wounds and seek shelter in the cave. His condition, when found, reflected the severity of the bear attack and the incredible determination that had allowed him to survive for as long as he did. Deep claw wounds on his back and legs had resulted in significant blood loss, and exposure to cold temperatures had led to severe hypothermia. Most tragically, his emergency beacon had been damaged during the attack, preventing him from calling for help. Harrison's journal, found beside his body, provided a detailed account of the bear encounter and his subsequent struggle for survival. The final entry, written approximately 12 hours before his death, expressed hope that search teams would find him and warned about the aggressive behavior of the bear that had attacked him. The bear was unlike anything I've encountered in 15 years of backcountry hiking, Harrison had written. It showed no fear of humans and seemed to be actively hunting rather than defending territory. Anyone entering this area needs to be warned that normal bear safety protocols may not be sufficient against this animal. The recovery of Harrison's body provided crucial evidence for both the wildlife management response and the investigation into the circumstances that had led to his death. His detailed journal entries would prove invaluable in understanding the bear's behavior and developing strategies to prevent similar attacks in the future. Dr. Chen's medical examination of Harrison's body revealed the full extent of the bear attack and the remarkable survival effort that had followed. He sustained massive trauma from the initial attack but was able to treat his wounds well enough to survive for approximately 48 hours, Chen reported. His death appears to have resulted from a combination of blood loss, hypothermia, and dehydration, rather than the immediate effects of the bear attack. The news of Harrison's death was devastating for Laura's group, who had spent 4 days hoping that their discovery of the attack scene might lead to a successful rescue. The realization that Harrison had survived for days while they were hiking nearby, unaware of his situation, added another layer of trauma to an already difficult experience. If we had found the attack scene even 6 hours earlier, we might have been able to save him, Laura said during the debriefing session following Harrison's recovery. The timing is heartbreaking. He was still alive when we were setting up camp at Flint's Park, less than 5 kilometers from his location. Dr. Morrison's response reflected the cruel realities of wilderness emergency response. Even if you had found the attack scene immediately after it occurred, reaching Harrison's location would have required specialized rescue equipment and techniques that your group didn't possess. The terrain where he took shelter was accessible only by helicopter insertion and technical climbing. The recovery of Harrison's body also provided additional intelligence about the aggressive bear's behavior patterns. Claw marks and scat found near the cave indicated that the animal had visited the location multiple times during the days following the attack, apparently monitoring Harrison's condition. The bear's behavior suggests a level of intelligence and persistence that's extremely unusual, Dr. Morrison explained. Most bears would have lost interest after the initial attack, but this animal appeared to be tracking Harrison's movement and waiting for an opportunity to return. The implications of this behavior pattern were deeply disturbing for wildlife management officials. The bear had demonstrated not only willingness to attack humans, but also the tactical intelligence to track and monitor victims over extended periods. This combination of aggression and intelligence made it an unprecedented threat to public safety. Parks Canada's response to the Harrison killing involved the largest wildlife management operation in the park's history. Teams of specialists equipped with dart guns, tracking equipment, and emergency medical supplies were deployed throughout the region to locate and destroy the aggressive bear. The radio collar worn by Bear 318 provided his general location, but close approach required careful planning to avoid additional casualties. The bear had demonstrated his willingness to attack humans, and his size and strength made him capable of killing multiple people before being stopped by conventional weapons. The operation to locate and destroy Bear 318 began on the 5th day after Harrison's body was recovered. Wildlife management teams used helicopters to track the radio collar signal while maintaining safe distances from the animal. The plan was to locate the bear in an area suitable for helicopter-based shooting, allowing specialists to destroy the animal without putting ground personnel at risk. However, Bear 318's behavior continued to confound expectations. Rather than following normal bear movement patterns, he appeared to be actively avoiding areas where helicopters were operating while simultaneously moving toward areas of known human activity. This bear has learned to associate helicopter sounds with danger while continuing to seek out human contact, reported wildlife specialist Dr. Alan Crawford, who was leading the operation. He's demonstrating a level of behavioral adaptation that suggests exceptional intelligence and learning ability. The unusual behavior patterns meant that conventional wildlife management techniques were proving ineffective. Attempts to approach the bear by helicopter resulted in him retreating to areas with dense forest cover where shooting was impossible. Ground-based approaches were deemed too dangerous given his demonstrated aggression toward humans. After 3 days of unsuccessful attempts to locate and destroy Bear 318, Parks Canada made the decision to expand the operation to include military resources. The Canadian Forces provided specialized marksmen and equipment designed for dangerous situations where conventional law enforcement techniques were insufficient. The military involvement reflected the unprecedented nature of the situation. Never before in the history of Banff National Park had a single bear posed such a significant and persistent threat to public safety. The animal's combination of size, intelligence, and learned aggression created a situation that exceeded the capabilities of normal wildlife management resources. While the bear hunt continued, Laura's group faced the psychological aftermath of their wilderness education expedition that had become a survival situation and tragic discovery. The trauma of finding evidence of Harrison's attack, participating in the search operation, and learning of his death created lasting emotional impact that would require professional treatment for several group members. Dr. Reynolds, despite his psychiatric training, found himself experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and anxiety about future wilderness activities. Understanding the clinical aspects of trauma doesn't make you immune to experiencing it, he acknowledged during follow-up interviews. Patricia Williams returned to her high school teaching position, but found herself unable to discuss outdoor education or wildlife conservation without experiencing emotional distress. Her plan to incorporate her wilderness experience into her curriculum was abandoned as she struggled to process the traumatic events. Bobby Thompson's career as a wildlife photographer was permanently affected by the experience. His previous confidence in reading bear behavior and maintaining safety in dangerous situations was shattered by the realization that his expertise might be insufficient against truly aggressive predators. "I've spent years photographing bears and thought I understood their behavior," he said during a television interview about the incident. "This experience taught me that there are individual animals whose behavior falls completely outside normal parameters, and no amount of experience can prepare you for that." The married couple, Maria and Carlos Santos, found that their shared traumatic experience initially brought them closer together, but ultimately created strain in their relationship. Maria's career as an environmental journalist was complicated by her newfound understanding of the real dangers present in wilderness areas, while Carlos struggled with survivor guilt about Harrison's death. "We were hiking through the same area where someone was dying, and we had no idea," Carlos said during counseling sessions. "The randomness of survival in that situation is something I'm still trying to process." James Fletcher, despite his military experience with dangerous situations, found that the wilderness trauma affected him differently than combat stress. "In military situations, you understand the threats and have training specifically designed to deal with them," he explained. "In the wilderness, you're dealing with forces that don't follow human logic or military doctrine." Dr. Chen returned to his emergency room practice with a new perspective on wilderness medicine and trauma response. His experience treating trauma victims in urban settings had not prepared him for the challenges of providing medical care in remote areas where evacuation might be delayed for hours. "The Harrison case taught me that wilderness medicine requires completely different thinking about resource allocation and treatment priorities," he said. "In the emergency room, I have immediate access to blood products, surgical facilities, and specialist consultations. In the wilderness, you're working with basic supplies and no backup." Laura McKinney faced the most complex emotional aftermath of the group as she struggled with feelings of responsibility for leading the expedition into danger. Despite professional counseling and support from Parks Canada officials, she was unable to return to wilderness guiding and eventually took a leave of absence from her teaching position. "I keep thinking about all the decisions we made that led us to that place at that time," she said during one of many counseling sessions. "If we had chosen a different route or delayed our departure by even one day, Michael Harrison might still be alive." Dr. Morrison's response to Laura's guilt reflected the professional perspective of someone who had investigated dozens of wildlife incidents. "The circumstances that led to Harrison's death were not predictable based on available information. Your group followed all appropriate safety protocols and made reasonable decisions throughout your expedition. The tragedy resulted from an unprecedented combination of factors that no one could have anticipated. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Harrison's death would ultimately reveal significant systemic failures in wildlife management and public safety protocols. The incident reports describing Bear 318's aggressive behavior had been filed with local ranger stations, but never forwarded to central wildlife management authorities who might have issued area closures or warnings. Parks Canada's review of their wildlife monitoring systems revealed that radio collar data was being used primarily for research purposes rather than real-time threat assessment. The technology existed to monitor bear movement patterns and identify potentially dangerous behavioral changes, but protocols for acting on this information were inadequate. We had the capability to track this bear's location and movement patterns, but we didn't have systems in place to identify when those patterns indicated increased risk to public safety, admitted Parks Canada Director Dr. Sarah Mitchell during congressional hearings about the incident. The legal implications of the Harrison death extended beyond Parks Canada to include potential liability for the equipment manufacturer whose emergency beacon had failed during the attack. Harrison's family filed wrongful death lawsuits against both the federal government and the beacon manufacturer, claiming that proper equipment function and timely warnings could have prevented the tragedy. The beacon manufacturer's investigation revealed that the device had been damaged by the bear attack itself, with claw marks visible on the antenna housing that had prevented signal transmission. However, the family's legal team argued that emergency equipment should be designed to withstand the forces likely to be encountered during the emergencies for which it was intended. Parks Canada's legal response included acknowledgement of systemic failures in wildlife monitoring and public warning systems, leading to a settlement with Harrison's family that included financial compensation and commitments to improve safety protocols. The settlement amount was not disclosed, but legal experts estimated it in the millions of dollars. The bear hunt for Bear 318 continued for 2 weeks after Harrison's body was recovered, involving dozens of personnel and sophisticated tracking equipment. The animal's ability to evade capture while continuing to pose a threat to public safety created an unprecedented situation that tested the limits of wildlife management capabilities. The breakthrough in the hunt came when Bear 318 was detected approaching a popular hiking trail used by day hikers who were unaware of the closure orders that had been issued for the area. The bear's movement toward occupied areas triggered an emergency response that included immediate evacuation of civilians and deployment of marksmen by helicopter. The final confrontation with Bear 318 occurred on a rocky ridge approximately 15 kilometers from where Harrison had been attacked. The bear was spotted by helicopter surveillance moving through an area of sparse vegetation that provided clear sight lines for shooting. The animal showed no fear of the helicopter and actually appeared to be moving toward it rather than away, reported the marksman who fired the shots that killed Bear 318. His behavior was completely contrary to normal bear responses to aircraft, which typically involve immediate retreat to heavy cover. The destruction of Bear 318 required multiple shots from a high-powered rifle, as the animal's size and aggression level meant that anything less than immediately lethal force could have resulted in additional casualties. The bear's final weight was measured at 892 pounds, confirming him as one of the largest grizzlies ever recorded in Banff National Park. Post-mortem examination of Bear 318 revealed evidence that explained his aggressive behavior toward humans. His stomach contents included synthetic fabric consistent with outdoor clothing, plastic items typically found in backpacks, and other non-food materials that indicated he had been feeding on human-related items for an extended period. This bear had learned to associate humans with food sources, and that association had evolved into predatory behavior, explained Dr. Morrison during the post-incident analysis. The presence of synthetic materials in his digestive system suggests he had been consuming camping gear and other human-related items, possibly for months before the fatal attack. The discovery of human clothing fragments in Bear 318's stomach raised the possibility that Harrison might not have been his first victim. Parks Canada initiated a review of missing person reports from the past year, looking for cases that might be connected to bear attacks that had gone unrecognized. The review identified 3 potential cases where solo hikers had disappeared in areas that overlapped with Bear 318's territory. However, the lack of physical evidence made it impossible to definitively link these disappearances to the aggressive bear. We may never know the full extent of this bear's impact on public safety, Dr. Mitchell acknowledged during the final incident report. The nature of solo hiking means that attacks can occur without witnesses, and victims may simply be listed as missing persons rather than wildlife fatalities. The systemic changes implemented by Parks Canada in response to the Harrison incident included real-time monitoring of all radio-collared bears for behavioral changes that might indicate increased aggression. Wildlife management protocols were revised to prioritize public safety over research objectives when tracking data suggested potential threats. New requirements for backcountry permits included mandatory safety briefings that addressed the specific risks associated with individual animals known to be active in the requested area. The generic safety information that had been provided to Laura's group was replaced with detailed current intelligence about wildlife activity and behavior patterns. Emergency communication requirements were enhanced to include redundant systems that would continue functioning even if primary equipment was damaged during an attack. The failure of Harrison's emergency beacon led to new standards for device durability and signal reliability under extreme conditions. The psychological support services available to wilderness incident survivors were also significantly enhanced following the trauma experienced by Laura's group. Parks Canada contracted with specialized counselors who understood the unique aspects of wilderness trauma and could provide appropriate treatment for survivors. Wilderness trauma differs from other types of traumatic experience because it involves fundamental questions about humanity's relationship with nature, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in treating outdoor recreation injuries. Survivors often struggle with fear of natural environments that previously provided them with recreation and spiritual renewal. The media coverage of the Harrison incident and the subsequent bear hunt created a national discussion about wilderness safety and the appropriate balance between public access to natural areas and protection from wildlife threats. Environmental groups argued that Bear 318's aggressive behavior was an aberration that should not be used to justify restrictions on wilderness access. Hunting organizations pointed to the incident as evidence that bear populations in national parks had grown beyond the carrying capacity of available habitat, leading to increased aggression and human-wildlife conflicts. They advocated for controlled hunting programs that would reduce bear numbers and eliminate aggressive individuals before they could pose threats to public safety. Tourism industry representatives expressed concern that extensive media coverage of the incident would deter visitors from national parks, resulting in economic impacts on communities that depended on outdoor recreation. They advocated for balanced reporting that emphasized the rarity of fatal bear attacks while acknowledging the need for appropriate safety precautions. The scientific community used the incident to advocate for increased research funding to better understand the factors that contribute to aggressive behavior in large predators. Dr. Morrison and other wildlife specialists argued that prevention of similar incidents required deeper knowledge of bear psychology and behavior modification. We need to understand why some individual bears develop aggressive tendencies toward humans, while others maintain their natural avoidance behaviors, Dr. Morrison explained during a scientific conference on human-wildlife conflicts. Without that understanding, we're limited to reactive responses rather than proactive prevention. The one-year anniversary of Harrison's death was marked by a memorial service attended by his family, members of Laura's group, and Parks Canada officials. The service, held at the trailhead where their expedition had begun, included the dedication of a plaque warning future hikers about the potential for dangerous wildlife encounters. The memorial plaque text reflected the complexity of the incident and the multiple lessons learned from the tragedy. In memory of Michael Harrison, who died in these mountains on October 9th, 2025. His death reminds us that wilderness areas are home to wild animals whose behavior can be unpredictable and dangerous. Respect for wildlife and careful attention to safety protocols are essential for all who venture into these beautiful but potentially hazardous environments. Laura McKinney attended the memorial service despite the emotional difficulty it represented for her. She had spent the year in intensive counseling and had recently made the decision to return to teaching, though she would not resume wilderness guiding activities. Michael's death taught me that even the most careful planning and preparation cannot eliminate all risks in wilderness environments, she said during the memorial service. But it also taught me that we cannot allow fear to prevent us from experiencing the natural world that provides so much beauty and meaning to our lives. Dr. Chen had returned to his emergency room practice with new expertise in wilderness medicine that he now taught to other medical professionals. His experience treating trauma in remote environments had led to his involvement in developing new protocols for wilderness emergency response. The Harrison case changed how I think about risk assessment and resource allocation in emergency medicine, he explained during a medical conference presentation. It demonstrated that distance from definitive medical care fundamentally changes treatment priorities and decision-making processes. James Fletcher had used his wilderness experience to develop new survival training programs for military personnel and law enforcement officers. His first-hand knowledge of how quickly wilderness situations could become life-threatening made him an effective instructor in survival psychology and decision-making under stress. The wilderness doesn't care about your rank, your experience, or your training, he told students in his survival courses. Nature operates according to its own rules, and survival depends on your ability to adapt to those rules, rather than trying to impose human logic on natural systems. Bobby Thompson had gradually returned to wildlife photography, but his approach to bear photography had been fundamentally changed by his experience. He now worked exclusively with telephoto lenses and maintained much greater distances from potentially dangerous animals. I learned that my previous confidence in reading bear behavior was based on limited experience with normal animals, he said during a photography workshop. There are individual bears whose behavior falls completely outside normal parameters, and no amount of experience can predict when you might encounter one of them. The married couple, Maria and Carlos Santos, had used their shared traumatic experience as the foundation for a new career in outdoor safety education. They developed wilderness safety courses that combined Maria's journalism skills with Carlos's medical training to create comprehensive programs for outdoor enthusiasts. Our experience taught us that wilderness education needs to go beyond generic safety information to address the psychological and emotional aspects of risk management, Maria explained during an interview about their new business. People need to understand not just what to do in emergency situations, but how to make sound decisions when they're stressed, frightened, and operating with limited information. Patricia Williams had modified her high school biology curriculum to include detailed units on human-wildlife conflicts and conservation challenges. Her traumatic experience had ultimately enhanced her teaching by providing real-world examples of the complex relationships between human activity and wildlife behavior. Students respond differently to conservation education when it's grounded in actual experience rather than theoretical knowledge, she said during a teacher training workshop. My experience in Banff gave me concrete examples of how human activity affects wildlife behavior and why conservation efforts are essential for public safety as well as environmental protection. Dr. Reynolds had incorporated his wilderness trauma experience into his research on ecotherapy and nature-based treatment for mental health conditions. His work now included protocols for ensuring that therapeutic outdoor activities don't expose patients to risks that could create additional trauma. The healing power of natural environments is real and significant, he explained during a psychiatric conference presentation. But we need to acknowledge that nature can also be a source of trauma, and our therapeutic approaches need to account for both the benefits and risks of wilderness experiences. The systemic changes implemented by Parks Canada in response to the Harrison incident had proven effective in preventing similar tragedies during the year following the attack. Enhanced wildlife monitoring and improved public warning systems had identified several potentially dangerous situations that were resolved before they could result in human casualties. The most significant test of the new protocols occurred 8 months after Harrison's death, when radio collar data indicated that another large male grizzly was exhibiting movement patterns and territorial behavior similar to Bear 318's pre-attack activities. The enhanced monitoring system triggered immediate area closures and intensive wildlife management intervention that resulted in the bear being relocated to a remote area away from human activity. The early warning capabilities we developed in response to the Harrison incident allowed us to identify and address a potential threat before it could result in human casualties, Dr. Mitchell reported during her annual safety briefing. This demonstrates that the tragic lessons learned from Michael's death are helping to protect future visitors to our parks. The economic impact of the incident on tourism in Banff National Park had been less severe than initially feared. While there was a temporary decrease in backcountry camping permits immediately following the extensive media coverage, visitor numbers had returned to normal levels within 6 months as the new safety protocols restored public confidence. The enhanced safety briefings and improved emergency communication systems had actually increased visitor satisfaction by providing more comprehensive information about wildlife behavior and safety protocols. Many visitors reported feeling more prepared and confident about their wilderness experiences as a result of the improved education programs. Paradoxically, the tragedy has ultimately made our parks safer and more enjoyable for visitors, explained Parks Canada Tourism Coordinator Janet Miller. The enhanced safety protocols provide visitors with better information and more effective emergency response capabilities, which allows them to pursue wilderness experiences with greater confidence. The legal settlements resulting from Harrison's death had provided his family with financial compensation, but family members emphasized that their primary motivation had been to ensure that systemic changes were implemented to prevent similar tragedies. Michael loved the wilderness and would have wanted his death to result in improvements that would protect other outdoor enthusiasts, said his brother David Harrison during a television interview. The changes that Parks Canada has implemented honor his memory by ensuring that future visitors have access to better safety information and more effective emergency response capabilities. The scientific research that emerged from the incident had contributed to a broader understanding of factors that contribute to aggressive behavior in large predators. Studies of Bear 318's brain tissue had revealed abnormalities in areas associated with fear response and aggression control, suggesting that his dangerous behavior might have resulted from physiological factors rather than purely learned behaviors. The neurological abnormalities we identified in Bear 318's brain tissue suggest that some aggressive behavior in wildlife may result from medical conditions rather than environmental factors, explained Dr. Rebecca Norton, a veterinary neurologist who conducted the post-mortem analysis. This finding has implications for how wildlife managers assess and respond to potentially dangerous animals. The research findings had led to new protocols for evaluating captured bears before relocation, including neurological assessments that might identify animals with brain abnormalities that could contribute to aggressive behavior. While such assessments could not be performed on free-ranging wildlife, they provided valuable information for making management decisions about captured animals. The broader scientific community had used the Harrison incident to advocate for increased research funding to better understand human-wildlife conflicts and develop more effective prevention strategies. The tragedy had demonstrated that conventional wildlife management approaches might be insufficient for dealing with individual animals whose behavior fell outside normal parameters. The Harrison case represents a worst-case scenario that tests the limits of our current wildlife management capabilities, explained Dr. Morrison during a congressional hearing on research funding. Preventing similar tragedies requires better understanding of the factors that contribute to aggressive behavior and more sophisticated tools for identifying potentially dangerous animals before they can threaten public safety. The international wildlife management community had studied the incident extensively, using it as a case study for developing improved protocols for dealing with aggressive large predators. The Canadian response had been praised for its comprehensiveness and effectiveness, serving as a model for other countries dealing with similar challenges. The systematic approach that Parks Canada implemented in response to the Harrison incident represents best practices for wildlife incident investigation and prevention, said Dr. James Mitchell of the International Association of Wildlife Managers. The lessons learned from this tragedy are being incorporated into wildlife management protocols worldwide. As the second anniversary of Harrison's death approached, the incident had become a defining moment in the history of human-wildlife conflict management in North America. The comprehensive response to the tragedy had resulted in measurable improvements in public safety while maintaining access to wilderness areas that provided recreational and spiritual benefits to millions of visitors. The legacy of Michael Harrison's death extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the bear attack. His death had catalyzed systemic changes in wildlife management, emergency response protocols, and public safety education that would protect countless future visitors to wilderness areas. Laura McKinney had gradually found peace with her role in the events that led to Harrison's discovery. Recognizing that her group's presence in the area and their professional response to finding the attack scene had been essential for understanding what had happened and preventing additional casualties. We were in the right place at the right time to discover evidence that helped wildlife managers understand the threat that Bear 318 posed to public safety, she reflected during a speech at a wilderness education conference. Michael's death was a tragedy, but our response to finding his attack scene may have prevented additional tragedies by providing the information needed to locate and destroy a dangerous predator. The members of Laura's wilderness education group had maintained contact with each other in the years following their traumatic experience, forming bonds that were strengthened by their shared survival of a life-threatening situation. Their annual reunions served both as memorials to Michael Harrison and celebrations of their own survival and recovery. The trauma we experienced brought us together in a way that normal friendships rarely achieve, explained Dr. Chen during one of these reunions. We survived something that tested our limits as human beings, and that shared experience created connections that will last for the rest of our lives. The broader impact of the incident on wilderness recreation and conservation had been largely positive, despite the tragedy that initiated the changes. Enhanced safety protocols and improved public education had made wilderness areas more accessible to people who might previously have been deterred by fear of wildlife encounters. The systematic improvements in safety protocols that resulted from Michael Harrison's death have actually made wilderness areas more welcoming to diverse populations who want to experience natural environments, explained outdoor recreation researcher Dr. Sandra Williams. Better safety information and more effective emergency response capabilities reduce barriers to wilderness access while maintaining the authentic wilderness experience that people seek. The story of the Harrison incident had become required reading in wilderness medicine courses, emergency response training programs, and wildlife management education throughout North America. The comprehensive documentation of the event provided a detailed case study that illustrated the complex interactions between human behavior, wildlife psychology, emergency response protocols, and systemic institutional factors. The Harrison case demonstrates how multiple small failures in different systems can combine to create a catastrophic situation, explained emergency management instructor Captain Robert Stevens. It also shows how systematic analysis of tragic events can lead to improvements that prevent similar tragedies while preserving the activities and experiences that make wilderness recreation valuable to society. 10 years after Michael Harrison's death in the remote wilderness of Banff National Park, the incident continued to influence wildlife management policies and wilderness safety protocols throughout North America. The comprehensive changes implemented in response to his tragic death had created a legacy of improved public safety that honored his memory while preserving access to the natural environments he had loved. The members of Laura McKinney's Wilderness Education Group had all found ways to incorporate their traumatic experience into positive contributions to outdoor recreation safety and wildlife conservation. Their collective response to tragedy had demonstrated the human capacity for growth, healing, and service that transformed personal trauma into public benefit. Michael Harrison died doing something he loved in a place that gave his life meaning, his brother David reflected during the 10th anniversary memorial service. The changes that resulted from his death have made it possible for countless other people to safely pursue the same wilderness experiences that brought him joy. That's a legacy he would have wanted. The story of the Banff Grizzly attack of 2025 served as a reminder that wilderness areas retained their essential wildness, with all the beauty and danger that such wildness entailed. The tragedy had not diminished the value of wilderness experiences, but had enhanced society's ability to pursue those experiences with appropriate respect for the natural forces that made them meaningful. As Laura McKinney stood at the memorial plaque marking the site where their expedition had begun 15 years earlier, she reflected on the journey that had taken her from trauma to healing, to renewed appreciation for the wilderness that had tested her so severely. Michael's death taught me that wilderness areas are not playgrounds designed for human recreation, she said during her remarks at the anniversary service. They are complex ecosystems governed by natural laws that we ignore at our peril, but they are also sources of beauty, wonder, and spiritual renewal that justify the risks involved in experiencing them. The key is ensuring that we approach them with the knowledge, preparation, and respect they deserve. D. The final chapter in the story of the 2025 Banff Grizzly attack had not yet been written, as the systemic changes implemented in response to the tragedy continued to evolve and improve. Michael Harrison's death had become a catalyst for ongoing improvements in wilderness safety that would protect future generations of outdoor enthusiasts who sought to experience the natural world that had given his life meaning. The wilderness remained wild, dangerous, and beautiful, but it had also become safer for those who approached it with proper preparation, appropriate respect, and the hard-won wisdom that had emerged from tragedy. That was Michael Harrison's ultimate legacy, the knowledge that had been purchased with his life and would protect countless others who followed in his footsteps on the ancient trails through the Canadian Rockies. The next stories: Ice and Shadows. The GPS coordinates read 70.2 degrees north, 28.4 degrees west, when Captain Henrik Larsson first spotted the massive white form moving across the ice floe. Through his binoculars, the shape appeared deceptively distant, a cream-colored smudge against the endless Arctic expanse of eastern Greenland. What he couldn't know in that moment, as the MS Arctic Pioneer churned through the dark waters of the Greenland Sea, was that this sighting would transform a routine expedition cruise into a harrowing tale of survival that would haunt everyone aboard for the rest of their lives. Dr. Elena Ramirez adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses and pulled her wool cap lower against the biting wind as she stood at the bow of the expedition vessel. At 42, she was a respected marine biologist from the University of California, San Diego, her weathered hands testament to decades of fieldwork in harsh environments. Beside her, her husband Miguel gripped the railing with white knuckles, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the intensity of someone who had spent 20 years as a search and rescue coordinator for the Coast Guard. Their teenage children, 17-year-old Sofia and 15-year-old Carlos, huddled nearby, their excitement about seeing polar bears in their natural habitat temporarily dampened by the fierce Arctic wind. The Ramirez family had planned this trip for 3 years, saving every penny of Elena's research grants and Miguel's pension to afford the $20,000 expedition to one of the most remote regions on Earth. Sofia, an aspiring photographer, had already filled 2 memory cards with images of icebergs and seabirds, while Carlos kept a detailed journal of their journey, recording water temperatures, wildlife sightings, and weather patterns with the meticulous attention that had earned him a place in his school's advanced science program. Captain Larsson, a grizzled Norwegian with 35 years of Arctic experience, had been tracking polar bears through these waters since the early 1990s. At 61, his beard was now completely white, matching the environment he knew better than perhaps any other living person. His vessel, the MS Arctic Pioneer, was a converted research ship that could accommodate 48 passengers and had been specifically reinforced for polar conditions. The ship's hull was rated for ice up to 3 feet thick, and its multiple redundant systems had been tested in some of the most extreme conditions on the planet. The expedition leader, Dr. James Morrison, was a celebrated wildlife photographer and naturalist who had led Arctic expeditions for National Geographic and the BBC. At 55, he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of polar bear behavior and had observed over 300 individual bears during his career. His assistant, 28-year-old Sarah Chen, was completing her doctorate in Arctic ecology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and had spent the previous summer on an ice research station in Svalbard. Among the other passengers were retired Canadian couple Robert and Margaret Thompson, both in their 70s, who had dreamed of seeing the Arctic since their honeymoon 48 years earlier. Robert, a former mining engineer, had worked in northern Canada for decades, but had never ventured this far into polar bear territory. Margaret, a retired librarian, had read every book she could find about Arctic exploration and kept a leather-bound journal filled with observations about their journey. The expedition's Zodiac boat operators were brothers Eric and Lars Peterson, both in their 30s, who had grown up in a small fishing village on the coast of Norway. They possessed an intimate knowledge of small boat operations in ice-filled waters and had been working expedition cruises for over a decade. Their younger sister Astrid, 25, served as the ship's marine biologist and ice navigator, her PhD from the University of Bergen, making her one of the youngest expedition staff members, but also one of the most knowledgeable about Arctic marine ecosystems. Dr. William Hayes, the ship's medical officer, was a 60-year-old emergency physician from Toronto who had volunteered his services in exchange for passage on the expedition. His medical bag contained everything from seasickness remedies to trauma surgery equipment, though he hoped the most serious injury he would encounter would be a case of sunburn or a twisted ankle during shore excursions. The morning of September 1st, 2025, dawned clear and bitterly cold, with temperatures hovering around -15 degrees Celsius. The sea was unusually calm for the Greenland Sea, with only a light chop disturbing the dark water between massive ice floes that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Dr. Morrison had identified what appeared to be ideal conditions for a close-approach polar bear viewing from the Zodiac boats, something that had been the highlight of the expedition itinerary since the journey began 5 days earlier in Reykjavik, Iceland. Elena stood in the ship's observation lounge at 0630 hours, sipping coffee from an insulated mug and reviewing her notes from the previous day's marine life observations. She had documented 3 species of Arctic seals, numerous seabirds, and what she believed might have been a small pod of narwhals in the distance. The water clarity was exceptional, allowing her to observe marine life at depths that would have been impossible in more temperate waters. Miguel emerged from their cabin carrying his emergency medical kit, a habit developed during his Coast Guard years that he had never been able to shake. Even on vacation, he found himself mentally cataloguing potential emergency scenarios and evacuation routes. The MS Arctic Pioneer was equipped with satellite communication equipment, emergency beacons, and a helicopter landing pad. But they were still more than 400 nautical miles from the nearest permanent settlement. Sofia and Carlos had been awake since 0600 hours, their excitement about the planned Zodiac excursion overriding any concerns about the early morning cold. Sofia's camera equipment was already prepared and protected against the extreme conditions, while Carlos had prepared his waterproof notebook to document their first close encounter with Arctic wildlife. At 0700 hours, Captain Larsen announced over the ship's intercom that a large adult polar bear had been spotted approximately 2 nautical miles to the northeast, moving slowly across a stable ice floe that appeared suitable for a close approach observation. The bear appeared to be a mature male, estimated at over 8 feet in length and potentially weighing more than 1,000 pounds, based on its massive build, visible through the ship's powerful binoculars. Dr. Morrison gathered the expedition participants in the main lounge for the mandatory safety briefing that preceded all Zodiac operations. His weathered face was serious as he outlined the protocols that had been developed over decades of polar bear research and wildlife observation. Participants were required to remain seated in the Zodiac boats at all times, maintain complete silence during approaches, and follow all instructions from the boat operators without question or delay. The polar bear safety protocols were extensive and had been developed through consultation with the Polar Bear Specialist Group of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. All Zodiac operators carried flare guns and noise-making devices, and Dr. Morrison himself carried a specialized rifle loaded with rubber bullets and bear spray as a last resort. However, he emphasized that in his 25 years of leading Arctic expeditions, he had never encountered a situation that required the use of deterrent measures beyond maintaining appropriate distances and respecting the animal's space. Sarah Chen provided a detailed briefing on polar bear behavior, explaining that the bears they might encounter were entering their most active hunting season as the sea ice expanded and seal populations became more accessible. Adult male polar bears like the one they had spotted could be particularly dangerous during this time of year, as they were often hungry and territorial after the relatively lean summer months when hunting opportunities were limited. The ice conditions were assessed as stable and suitable for approach, with the large floes showing no signs of cracking or movement that might indicate instability. The weather forecast called for continued clear conditions with light winds, providing ideal circumstances for close observation and photography. Water temperature was measured at -1.7 degrees Celsius, requiring dry suits for anyone who might accidentally enter the water. At 0830 hours, the first group of 12 passengers was loaded into 2 Zodiac boats for the initial approach. The Ramirez family was assigned to the lead boat operated by Eric Peterson, along with the Thompson couple and Dr. Morrison. The second boat, operated by Lars Peterson, carried 6 other passengers and Sarah Chen. Both boats were equipped with emergency equipment, including flares, emergency beacons, first aid kits, and communication radios, maintaining constant contact with the MS Arctic Pioneer. The Zodiac boats were specially designed for Arctic conditions, with reinforced hulls capable of handling contact with ice and powerful outboard motors that could operate reliably in extreme cold. Each boat carried emergency survival equipment, including insulated shelters, emergency food and water, and signaling devices that could be detected by satellite rescue systems from hundreds of miles away. As the Zodiac boats moved away from the expedition ship, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension that she had not experienced since her first deep-sea research dive 20 years earlier. The Arctic landscape was unlike anything she had ever encountered, with ice formations that stretched endlessly in every direction and a silence so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. The only sounds were the low rumble of the Zodiac's engine and the occasional crack of ice settling in the distance. Miguel's trained eye automatically assessed potential emergency scenarios as they moved across the dark water between ice floes. The water was so cold that survival time for anyone who fell in would be measured in minutes rather than hours, despite the dry suits they wore. The nearest solid ice appeared stable, but he noted that the ice floes were separated by channels of open water that could become impassable if weather conditions changed suddenly. Sophia raised her camera as they approached the massive ice floe where the polar bear had been spotted, her telephoto lens allowing her to capture images from what Dr. Morrison had determined was a safe distance of approximately 100 meters. Through her viewfinder, she could see the enormous bear more clearly than she had imagined possible, its thick white fur appearing almost luminescent against the blue-white ice. Carlos carefully recorded their position, speed, and approach angle in his waterproof notebook, noting that the polar bear appeared to be aware of their presence but showed no signs of agitation or defensive behavior. The bear continued its slow movement across the ice floe, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or investigate small holes in the ice that might indicate seal breathing holes. The polar bear was magnificent beyond anything the expedition participants had imagined possible. Standing nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours, the massive male appeared to weigh at least 1,200 pounds, with paws the size of dinner plates and a massive head that spoke to incredible power and strength. His thick coat showed the yellowish tinge that indicated an adult male in prime condition, and his movements displayed the deceptive grace that made polar bears such effective predators in their harsh environment. Dr. Morrison provided a quiet commentary as they observed the bear, explaining that they were witnessing one of the apex predators of the Arctic ecosystem. Polar bears possessed one of the most acute senses of smell in the animal kingdom, capable of detecting seals beneath 3 feet of snow and ice from distances of up to 20 miles. Their massive paws served as both weapons and tools, powerful enough to kill a seal with a single blow, but sensitive enough to test the thickness and stability of ice before committing their full weight. The bear's behavior appeared completely natural and undisturbed by their presence, suggesting that this individual had not had significant previous contact with humans. This was both reassuring and concerning, as bears without human experience were generally less predictable in their reactions, but also less likely to associate humans with food sources that might lead to aggressive behavior. Eric Peterson maintained the Zodiac boat's position with practiced skill, using subtle adjustments of the throttle and steering to compensate for wind and current while maintaining the precise distance that Dr. Morrison had determined was safe for observation. His years of experience in Arctic waters had taught him to read ice conditions, weather patterns, and animal behavior with an intuitive understanding that complemented the scientific knowledge of the expedition leaders. As the observation continued, other passengers from the MS Arctic Pioneer gathered at the ship's railings with binoculars and cameras, watching the Zodiac boats from a distance of approximately half a nautical mile. The ship's captain maintained constant radio contact with the Zodiac operators, monitoring weather conditions and ice movement that might affect the safety of the small boats. The polar bear suddenly stopped its movement across the ice floe and turned its massive head directly toward the Zodiac boats, its black nose testing the air as it attempted to identify the unfamiliar scents carried on the Arctic wind. For several long moments, bear and humans regarded each other across the expanse of ice and dark water, a meeting between species that represented millions of years of evolutionary separation, but shared the same harsh and unforgiving environment. Elena felt her breath catch as she looked into the bear's dark eyes, seeing an intelligence and awareness that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. This was not the cuddly creature of children's books or zoo exhibits, but a predator perfectly adapted to one of the most hostile environments on Earth, capable of surviving temperatures that would kill most living creatures and hunting prey in conditions that would challenge the most experienced human explorers. The bear's attention seemed to focus specifically on their Zodiac boat, its head tilting slightly, as if trying to determine whether these strange creatures represented a threat, prey, or simply an unusual curiosity in its territory. Dr. Morrison quietly instructed Eric Peterson to maintain their current position but be prepared to retreat if the bear showed any signs of approaching the water or displaying aggressive behavior. Polar bear attacks on humans were extremely rare, but Dr. Morrison knew that the statistics could be misleading. Most polar bear encounters occurred in inhabited areas where bears had been attracted by food sources or in situations where bears felt threatened or cornered. In the remote wilderness where they now found themselves, there were no established protocols beyond maintaining distance and avoiding any actions that might trigger a predatory response. The bear began to move again, but instead of continuing its previous path across the ice floe, it turned and began walking directly toward the edge of the ice closest to their position. Its movement was unhurried but purposeful, covering ground with a smooth gait that spoke to incredible strength and endurance. Each step brought the massive predator closer to the water's edge, closer to the position where the Zodiac boats waited. Dr. Morrison felt the first stirrings of concern as he watched the bear's approach. In 25 years of Arctic expeditions, he had observed hundreds of polar bears, but he had never seen one show this level of sustained interest in human observers. Most bears either ignored human presence entirely or retreated to avoid potential confrontation. This bear's direct approach was unusual and potentially concerning. Eric Peterson's hand moved to the throttle control as he prepared to increase their distance from the ice floe if necessary. His experience in Arctic waters had taught him that conditions could change rapidly and that the margin for error in polar bear encounters was essentially zero. The nearest safe landing spot was the MS Arctic Pioneer, approximately half a nautical mile away across open water and scattered ice floes. Sarah Chen, observing from the second Zodiac boat, began to document the bear's unusual behavior with both still photography and detailed written notes. As a polar bear researcher, she had studied hundreds of human bear encounters, but she had never personally witnessed a wild polar bear showing this level of direct interest in human observers. Her training suggested that they should begin to increase their distance from the ice floe as a precautionary measure. The bear reached the edge of the ice floe and stopped, its massive head extending over the dark water as it tested the air currents for scent information about the strange creatures floating in its territory. From a distance of approximately 100 meters, the expedition participants could see every detail of the bear's massive form, from the powerful muscles beneath its thick coat to the impressive size of its teeth as it opened its mouth to better process scent molecules. Robert Thompson, observing through binoculars from the lead Zodiac boat, whispered to his wife Margaret that this was the most magnificent and terrifying creature he had ever encountered. As a former mining engineer who had worked in northern Canada, he had seen black bears and grizzly bears, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer size and presence of a wild polar bear in its natural environment. Margaret Thompson documented the encounter in her leather journal, noting the time, weather conditions, and their exact position relative to the ice floe and the polar bear. Her librarian's training had given her an eye for detail and documentation that complemented the scientific observations being made by the expedition staff. She recorded that the bear appeared to be a mature male in excellent condition, showing no signs of injury or malnutrition that might affect its behavior. Carlos Ramirez continued his scientific observations, noting the bear's gait, size estimates, and behavioral patterns in his waterproof notebook. His attention to detail had already impressed Dr. Morrison and Sarah Chen, who recognized the teenager's potential for future scientific work in wildlife research. Carlos estimated the bear's weight at approximately 1,300 pounds based on its proportions and comparison to the ice formations around it. Sofia Ramirez captured hundreds of images as the bear approached the water's edge, her telephoto lens allowing her to document details that would be impossible to observe from a safe distance under normal circumstances. Her photographs would later be analyzed by polar bear researchers to better understand the behavioral patterns of wild bears encountering human observers in their natural habitat. The bear suddenly lowered its massive head and appeared to be testing the edge of the ice floe with its front paws, a behavior that Dr. Morrison recognized as assessment of ice stability before entering the water. Polar bears were excellent swimmers, capable of covering distances of over 60 miles in open water, and their swimming speed could exceed 6 miles per hour when pursuing prey or investigating something of interest. Dr. Morrison made the decision to signal Eric Peterson to begin a slow withdrawal from their current position, increasing their distance from the ice floe as a precautionary measure. The bear's behavior was not overtly aggressive, but its sustained interest in their presence was unusual enough to warrant additional caution. In polar bear safety protocols, any behavior that deviated from normal patterns was treated as potentially dangerous until proven otherwise. As the Zodiac boat began to move slowly away from the ice floe, the polar bear's head snapped up, its attention clearly focused on the movement of the small craft across the dark water. The bear's posture changed subtly but noticeably, with its head held higher and its body oriented more directly toward the boats. This was the type of focused attention that Dr. Morrison had learned to recognize as a potential precursor to more active investigation. Elena noticed the change in the bear's demeanor and felt a cold sensation in her stomach that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature. Her experience as a marine biologist had taught her to recognize predatory behavior in aquatic mammals, and she was beginning to see similar patterns in the polar bear's focused attention and body language. The bear was no longer simply curious about their presence. It was actively evaluating them as potential prey or threats. Miguel's Coast Guard training activated as he observed the bear's changing behavior and Dr. Morrison's decision to increase their distance from the ice floe. His mind automatically began calculating distances, escape routes, and emergency procedures, though he knew that their options were limited by the extreme environment and the vast distances involved. The MS Arctic Pioneer represented their only realistic refuge, but it was still several minutes away, even at the Zodiac's maximum speed. The polar bear made its decision with the sudden, decisive movement that characterized apex predators. Without hesitation, the massive animal slipped into the dark Arctic water with barely a splash, its powerful limbs immediately propelling it toward the Zodiac boats with a speed and grace that shocked the human observers. The bear's swimming motion was smooth and efficient, its massive head held well above the water as it closed the distance between the ice floe and the boats. Eric Peterson immediately increased the Zodiac's speed as he saw the bear enter the water, but he knew that their advantage was limited. Zodiac boats were not designed for high-speed operation in ice-filled waters, and the risk of collision with ice floes or mechanical failure increased dramatically with speed. The polar bear, meanwhile, was perfectly adapted for high-speed swimming in Arctic conditions and showed no signs of hesitation or fatigue as it pursued the boats. Dr. Morrison grabbed the emergency radio and transmitted an urgent message to Captain Larson aboard the MS Arctic Pioneer, reporting that they had a polar bear in the water actively pursuing their Zodiac boats and requesting immediate assistance. The ship's engines immediately increased to full power as Captain Larson ordered all available crew to prepare for emergency rescue operations. Sarah Chen, observing from the second Zodiac boat operated by Lars Peterson, documented the bear's swimming speed and behavior while simultaneously preparing emergency flares and noise-making devices that might be used to deter the bear if it continued its pursuit. Her research background had included study of polar bear swimming capabilities, but witnessing the reality was far more impressive and terrifying than any academic description. The bear's swimming speed was remarkable, covering the distance between the ice floe and the Zodiac boats far more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Its powerful strokes propelled its massive body through the near-freezing water with an efficiency that spoke to millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to the Arctic marine environment. The bear's dark eyes remained fixed on the lead Zodiac boat containing the Ramirez family, showing a level of focus and determination that was deeply unsettling to observe. Eric Peterson pushed the Zodiac's engine to its maximum safe speed while attempting to navigate around scattered ice floes that could damage the boat's hull or propeller if struck at high speed. The boat's reinforced construction provided some protection, but a catastrophic mechanical failure in these conditions would be fatal for everyone aboard. Behind them, the polar bear continued its relentless pursuit, showing no signs of fatigue or hesitation. Sofia Ramirez continued photographing even as the bear closed the distance to their boat, her photographer's instincts overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze her. Through her camera's viewfinder, she could see details of the bear's swimming technique that revealed the incredible power and adaptation that made polar bears such effective predators in the Arctic environment. Carlos Ramirez maintained his scientific observations even in the face of immediate danger, noting the bear's swimming speed, stroke pattern, and apparent motivation for pursuing their boat. His detailed documentation would later prove valuable to researchers studying polar bear behavior. though at the moment his scientific curiosity was tempered by growing fear as the massive predator continued to close the distance between them. The polar bear was now less than 50 meters behind the lead Zodiac boat and showed no signs of abandoning its pursuit. Dr. Morrison prepared the emergency flare gun while instructing Eric Peterson to continue their course toward the MS Arctic Pioneer, which was now visible in the distance and approaching at maximum speed. The ship's powerful engines and reinforced hull made it the only truly safe refuge in the vast Arctic seascape. Elena Ramirez found herself face to face with the reality that her scientific training had prepared her for intellectually, but not emotionally. The polar bear pursuing their boat was not a research subject or a conservation statistic, but a massive predator that appeared intent on investigating their small boat and its human occupants. Her marine biology background had included study of predator-prey relationships, but experiencing the reality from the prey perspective was profoundly different from academic understanding. Miguel Ramirez's Coast Guard experience had included numerous rescue operations in dangerous conditions, but nothing had prepared him for the unique challenges of polar bear encounter in Arctic waters. His training emphasized preparation, communication, and coordinated response, but the remote location and extreme environment limited their options to basic survival and evasion tactics. The distance between the polar bear and the lead Zodiac boat continued to decrease, despite Eric Peterson's skilled operation of the small craft. The bear's swimming endurance appeared limitless, and its determination to investigate or pursue the boat showed no signs of weakening. Dr. Morrison made the difficult decision to fire a warning flare in the bear's direction, hoping that the noise and bright light might discourage its continued pursuit. The emergency flare streaked across the Arctic sky with a brilliant red light and a sharp explosive sound that echoed across the ice floes and open water. For a moment, the polar bear stopped its forward progress and raised its massive head higher in the water, apparently startled by the unexpected noise and light. However, after only a brief hesitation, the bear resumed its pursuit with what appeared to be increased determination. The warning flare had the unintended consequence of attracting the bear's attention more directly to their boat, rather than discouraging its approach. Dr. Morrison realized that the bear might be interpreting the flare as a challenge or territorial display rather than a deterrent signal. Polar bears in their natural environment had no experience with human technology and might respond unpredictably to unfamiliar stimuli. Lars Peterson, operating the second Zodiac boat, maneuvered his craft to create a distraction that might divide the bear's attention between the two boats. However, the polar bear showed no interest in the second boat and maintained its focused pursuit of the lead Zodiac containing the Ramirez family. This selective attention suggested that the bear had identified their specific boat as its primary target for reasons that remained unclear. The MS Arctic Pioneer was now less than 200 meters away and closing rapidly, but the polar bear was only 30 meters behind the lead Zodiac boat and continuing to gain ground. Captain Larson prepared emergency rescue equipment while Dr. Hayes, the ship's medical officer, prepared for potential trauma treatment. The ship's crew had trained for various emergency scenarios, but polar bear encounters had always been considered unlikely due to the safety protocols and experienced expedition leadership. Eric Peterson's skillful operation of the Zodiac boat was the only factor preventing the polar bear from reaching them, but even his expertise had limitations in the face of the bear's swimming capabilities and determination. The boat's engine was operating at maximum capacity, creating a risk of mechanical failure that could leave them dead in the water with a massive predator only meters away. The polar bear suddenly accelerated its swimming pace, closing the final distance to the Zodiac boat with powerful strokes that brought its massive form within reaching distance of the boat's stern. Dr. Morrison prepared to use the bear spray as a last resort, though he knew that its effectiveness in Arctic wind conditions was questionable at best. At that critical moment, Captain Larsen brought the MS Arctic Pioneer alongside the Zodiac boats with a precision that demonstrated his decades of Arctic experience. The ship's massive bulk created a barrier between the polar bear and the small boats, while crew members prepared emergency rescue equipment to bring the Zodiac occupants aboard the ship as quickly as possible. The polar bear, suddenly confronted with the massive expedition ship, stopped its pursuit and treaded water while apparently reassessing the situation. The ship represented something far too large for the bear to consider as potential prey, and its presence seemed to break the focused attention that had driven the bear's pursuit of the Zodiac boat. Eric Peterson maneuvered the lead Zodiac boat alongside the MS Arctic Pioneer's boarding platform, while crew members secured lines and prepared to assist the passengers aboard the ship. The entire transfer operation took less than 3 minutes, but those minutes felt like hours to the expedition participants who had just experienced one of the closest polar bear encounters ever documented. The Ramirez family was brought aboard the ship with hands shaking from both cold and adrenaline, their close encounter with one of the Arctic's most formidable predators having lasted only minutes, but creating memories that would last a lifetime. Elena's scientific training had prepared her to observe and document wildlife behavior, but experiencing the reality of being pursued by a polar bear had given her a profound new respect for the power and capabilities of Arctic predators. Miguel's Coast Guard experience had included many dangerous rescue operations, but nothing had prepared him for the unique challenges of polar bear encounters in remote Arctic waters. His training emphasized teamwork, communication and preparation, all of which had proved essential during their escape from the pursuing bear. Sofia and Carlos had documented the entire encounter with photographs and detailed notes that would later prove valuable to polar bear researchers studying human-wildlife interactions in the Arctic. Their scientific curiosity had been tempered by real fear, but their documentation provided a unique perspective on polar bear behavior that would contribute to future safety protocols. The polar bear remained in the water near the MS Arctic Pioneer for several minutes, apparently investigating the large ship before eventually swimming back toward the ice floe where it had originally been observed. Its behavior throughout the encounter had been consistent with curiosity and investigation rather than aggressive predation. But the outcome could have been catastrophic if not for the skill of the expedition crew and the proximity of the expedition ship. Dr. Morrison conducted a thorough debriefing with all expedition participants, analyzing the encounter to identify lessons learned and potential improvements to safety protocols. The bear's unusual behavior in pursuing the Zodiac boat was documented and would be shared with polar bear researchers and other expedition operators to improve understanding of human-wildlife interactions in the Arctic. Captain Larsen modified the expedition's remaining Zodiac operations to include additional safety measures and reduced approach distances to wildlife, though he emphasized that the encounter they had just experienced was highly unusual and not representative of typical polar bear behavior in the wild. The remainder of the expedition proceeded without further wildlife encounters of such intensity, though all participants found their appreciation for the Arctic environment and its wildlife profoundly deepened by their experience. The polar bear they had encountered remained in the area for several more days, occasionally visible from the ship but showing no further interest in human activities. Elena Ramirez completed her marine biology research objectives during the remaining days of the expedition, but found that her scientific perspective had been fundamentally changed by the direct encounter with Arctic wildlife. Her research publications would later include detailed analysis of polar bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions that drew directly from her personal experience during the encounter. Miguel Ramirez incorporated lessons learned from the polar bear encounter into his Coast Guard training programs, emphasizing the unique challenges of emergency response in remote Arctic environments where traditional rescue resources were not available. Sofia Ramirez's photographs from the polar bear encounter were later featured in National Geographic and other wildlife publications, providing visual documentation of polar bear swimming behavior and human-wildlife interactions that contributed to conservation and safety research. Carlos Ramirez's detailed scientific observations during the encounter earned him recognition from Arctic researchers and contributed to his acceptance into advanced marine biology programs that would eventually lead to a career in polar wildlife research. The MS Arctic Pioneer returned to Reykjavik after completing the remainder of its expedition itinerary, carrying passengers who had experienced one of the closest polar bear encounters ever safely documented. Their story would be shared with future expedition participants as both a testament to the incredible wildlife of the Arctic and a reminder of the respect and caution required when entering the territory of Earth's most formidable predators. The polar bear they had encountered was later identified through photographic analysis as a previously unknown individual, designated as Bear number GB 2025-01 in the Greenland Polar Bear Research Database. Subsequent observations suggested that this bear was a mature male in excellent condition, with no apparent injuries or conditions that might have explained his unusual interest in human observers. Dr. Morrison's expedition reports were shared with the International Association of Antarctic and Arctic Tour Operators, contributing to updated safety guidelines for polar bear encounters during expedition cruises. The incident highlighted the importance of experienced leadership, proper safety equipment, and emergency response capabilities when operating in polar bear habitat. The encounter was also documented by the Polar Bear Specialist Group of the International Union for Conservation of Nature as an example of successful non-lethal resolution of a close human polar bear encounter. The fact that no humans or wildlife were harmed during the incident was attributed to proper safety protocols, experienced expedition leadership, and appropriate emergency response. Years later, the Ramirez family would still gather each September 1st to commemorate their Arctic adventure and their close encounter with one of nature's most magnificent predators. Their experience had given them a profound appreciation for Arctic wildlife and the importance of conservation efforts to protect polar bear habitat in the face of climate change and human development. The story of their encounter would be told and retold at family gatherings, each telling adding new details and perspectives as the participants processed their experience and its meaning. For Elena, the encounter reinforced her commitment to marine conservation research. For Miguel, it highlighted the importance of emergency preparedness and training. For Sofia and Carlos, it sparked lifelong interests in wildlife photography and polar research, respectively. Dr. Morrison continued leading Arctic expeditions for several more years, though the polar bear encounter remained one of the most dramatic and memorable experiences of his career. His safety protocols and emergency response procedures, refined through decades of experience and validated during the encounter, became standard practice for expedition operators throughout the Arctic. The MS Arctic Pioneer continued operating expedition cruises in polar waters, carrying new groups of adventurous travelers eager to experience the incredible wildlife and landscapes of the Arctic. Captain Larson's skilled seamanship and Dr. Morrison's wildlife expertise continued to provide safe and educational experiences for thousands of expedition participants over the following years. The polar bear, designated Bear number GB 2025-01, was occasionally spotted by subsequent expeditions in the same general area, though he showed no further unusual interest in human observers. His behavior during the encounter with the Ramirez family remained an anomaly, in polar bear research, a reminder that individual animals can display behaviors that challenge our understanding of species-typical patterns. The photographs and documentation from the encounter contributed to several scientific publications about polar bear swimming behavior, human-wildlife interactions, and expedition safety protocols. The detailed records kept by multiple observers provided researchers with unprecedented documentation of a close-range polar bear encounter and successful non-lethal resolution. Climate change research in the years following the encounter revealed that the Arctic region where they had met the polar bear was experiencing some of the most rapid environmental changes on Earth. Sea ice formation patterns were shifting, affecting polar bear hunting success and potentially contributing to more frequent encounters between bears and humans as both species adapted to changing conditions. Conservation organizations used the story of the encounter to highlight both the incredible adaptability of polar bears and their vulnerability to environmental changes that threatened their habitat. The successful resolution of a potentially dangerous encounter demonstrated that humans and polar bears could coexist when proper precautions and respect for wildlife were maintained. The expedition industry incorporated lessons learned from the encounter into training programs for guides and expedition leaders, emphasizing the importance of wildlife behavior knowledge, emergency preparedness, and coordinated response to unexpected situations. The encounter had demonstrated that even the most experienced expedition leaders could face situations that challenged established protocols and required immediate adaptation. Educational programs about Arctic wildlife began incorporating the story of the Ramirez family's encounter as an example of how human activities in polar bear habitat required careful planning, experienced leadership, and constant vigilance. The story illustrated both the incredible privilege of observing Arctic wildlife in its natural environment and the responsibility that came with entering the territory of one of Earth's most powerful predators. The encounter remained a defining moment for everyone who experienced it, a reminder of the raw power and beauty of the natural world and the thin line between observation and participation in the drama of Arctic survival. Their story joined the long tradition of Arctic exploration narratives, though their encounter had ended with safety and appreciation rather than tragedy. In the years that followed, the Arctic continued to change rapidly due to climate change, with sea ice extent and quality declining significantly. The habitat where they had encountered the polar bear was particularly affected, with ice formation occurring later and breakup happening earlier each year. These changes affected polar bear behavior and hunting success, potentially making encounters with humans more likely as bears adapted to changing conditions. Research stations and monitoring programs established in the region provided ongoing documentation of polar bear populations and behavior. With the encounter between bear number GB 2025-01 and the expedition participants serving as baseline data for understanding human-wildlife interactions in a rapidly changing environment. The story of their encounter was eventually featured in a documentary about Arctic wildlife and climate change, with interviews from all the participants providing multiple perspectives on their shared experience. The documentary emphasized both the incredible beauty of Arctic wildlife and the urgent need for conservation action to protect polar bear habitat for future generations. Sofia Ramirez's photographs from the encounter were displayed in museums and galleries around the world, providing viewers with a visceral understanding of the power and majesty of polar bears in their natural environment. Her images captured not only the physical characteristics of the bear, but also the intensity of the encounter and the emotions of the human participants. Carlos Ramirez's scientific documentation of the encounter contributed to his acceptance into graduate programs in Arctic ecology, where his research focused on the impacts of climate change on polar bear behavior and distribution. His first-hand experience with polar bear behavior provided unique insights that enhanced his academic research. The encounter had lasting impacts on Arctic expedition safety protocols, with new requirements for backup communication systems, enhanced medical equipment, and improved emergency response training. The successful resolution of their encounter demonstrated that preparation and training could make the difference between tragedy and triumph in extreme environments. Decade later, the participants still maintained contact with each other and with the expedition crew who'd ensured their safety during the encounter. Their shared experience had created bonds that transcended the brief duration of their Arctic voyage, connecting them through one of the most intense wildlife encounters any of them would ever experience. The polar bear they had encountered became something of a legend in Arctic expedition circles, with subsequent sightings documented and shared among expedition operators and researchers. His behavior during the encounter remained unique in polar bear research literature, a reminder that individual animals could display personalities and behaviors that defied scientific predictions. Dr. Morrison eventually retired from leading expeditions, but continued to consult on Arctic safety protocols and wildlife encounter procedures. His experience during the polar bear encounter had reinforced his belief that respectful observation of wildlife required constant vigilance, proper preparation, and the humility to recognize that humans were visitors in the territory of perfectly adapted predators. The legacy of their encounter extended far beyond the immediate participants, contributing to improved safety protocols, enhanced understanding of polar bear behavior, and increased awareness of the incredible wildlife that inhabited one of Earth's most extreme environments. Their story became part of the long tradition of Arctic exploration, though their expedition had ended with appreciation and respect rather than conquest. The Arctic region, where they had encountered the polar bear, continued to serve as a living laboratory for researchers studying climate change impacts on polar wildlife. The detailed documentation from their encounter provided baseline data that helped scientists understand how polar bears might adapt their behavior in response to changing environmental conditions. Years of subsequent research revealed that the polar bear they had encountered was part of a genetically distinct population that showed unique adaptations to the specific environmental conditions of their region. His behavior during the encounter may have reflected individual characteristics or population-specific traits that differed from polar bears in other Arctic regions. The story of their encounter was included in academic curricula about wildlife conservation, human-wildlife interactions, and expedition safety management. Students studying these fields learned from the detailed documentation and successful resolution of a potentially dangerous situation in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Conservation funding organizations used the story and photographs from the encounter to support Arctic research and habitat protection programs. The visceral impact of the close encounter helped communicate the urgency of conservation efforts to protect polar bear populations facing unprecedented environmental challenges. The encounter had demonstrated that even experienced expedition leaders with decades of Arctic experience could face situations that challenged established protocols and required immediate adaptation. This lesson influenced training programs for guides and expedition leaders, emphasizing the importance of mental flexibility and rapid decision-making in emergency situations. The polar bear they had encountered, bear number GB 2025-01, was eventually tracked using satellite collar technology as part of a broader research program studying polar bear movement patterns and habitat use. His tracking data revealed extensive travels across the Arctic ice pack and provided insights into the vast territories required by individual polar bears for successful survival. Their encounter remained unique in polar bear research literature, with no subsequent documented cases of similar pursuit behavior directed at human observers. This uniqueness added to the scientific value of their documentation while reinforcing the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters in natural environments. The photographs and video footage from the encounter were archived in natural history museums and research institutions, providing permanent documentation of polar bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions for future researchers and educators. The visual records captured details of polar bear swimming technique and behavior that would be valuable for decades to come. Climate change projections for the Arctic suggested that the region where they had encountered the polar bear would continue experiencing rapid environmental changes, with potential implications for polar bear behavior and distribution. Their encounter provided a snapshot of human-wildlife interactions under environmental conditions that might not exist in future decades. The successful resolution of their encounter without harm to humans or wildlife became a model for expedition operators and wildlife researchers working in polar bear habitat. Their experience demonstrated that proper training, equipment, and decision-making could enable safe observation of Arctic wildlife even during unexpected close encounters. The story of their encounter with bear number GB 2025-01 became part of the cultural heritage of Arctic exploration, joining the narratives of previous generations who had ventured into polar regions and encountered the incredible wildlife that thrived in Earth's most extreme environments. Their story would inspire future generations of researchers, conservationists, and adventurers, while serving as a reminder of the respect and preparation required for safe wildlife observation in the Arctic.